1944. World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy,
the water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
To the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
On the 6th of June 1944, Allied sea, ground and air forces came together to launch the largest amphibious assault in military history, codenamed Operation Neptune. It took 18 months of massive planning efforts, but what's known as the longest day came at a cost, with thousands of casualties on both sides. This is the story of D-Day, the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. By 1944, Nazi Germany had dominated most of Europe for over 4 years. But now, World War II was starting to swing in the Allies' favor. In the Mediterranean, German forces had been chased out of North Africa and were dug in across Italy. And on the Eastern Front in Russia, they'd suffered disastrous defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, and now struggled to hold back Stalin's Red Army. While the defeat of Germany's feared U-boats allowed US troops and supplies to pour into Britain, ahead of a much-anticipated Allied invasion of Europe. The question now was how to win the war.
To win the war, Stalin had argued very strongly for the opening of a second front. Since 1941 and the invasion of the German forces into the Soviet Union, the Soviets had actually taken the brunt of the fighting. About 80% of the German army were fighting in the east. And this is why Stalin urged the Western Allies to open a second front to basically relieve some pressure of the Eastern Front and give the Soviets some breathing space, so to speak.
Churchill and Roosevelt agreed that the Second Front would be launched in summer 1944. And the person they wanted in charge to coordinate the Allied nations was American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. General Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. He had never seen frontline combat, but Eisenhower was an exceptional military planner with an instinctive grasp of modern warfare. Eisenhower's abilities would be tested to the full as he took on responsibility for the single most important Allied operation of the war. The first dilemma: where to land? The obvious choice was Pas-de-Calais, just 20 miles from England and the most direct route to Germany, which was why the Germans had concentrated their beach defenses and troops here. So they turned instead to Normandy. If the Allies could establish a foothold in Normandy, they could then build up their forces and launch a breakout operation, liberating Paris and beginning the advance on Germany itself. The invasion would hinge on the success of the first 24 hours, known as D-Day. Ground troops would be drawn from the 21st Army Group, commanded by British General Bernard Montgomery. 7 British, US and Canadian infantry divisions, 3 armoured brigades and 3 airborne divisions were earmarked to spearhead the operation.
The divisions with which the Allies were to fight the Battle of Normandy and the rest of the 1944-45 campaign were a mixture of veteran formations which had fought in some cases from Egypt and North Africa and then through Italy. And with them, there were divisions going into action for the first time.
18-year-old Frank Rosier was a private serving with 2nd Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment. A London boy that had survived the Blitz, he lost his eye after 3 months in battle.
This is my first time in action, and there is a period of, we're not playing cowboys and Indians in the woods, this is the real thing.
Wally Harris was a craftsman and one of the founding members of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers.
We felt privileged to think, well, we've been chosen to lead the assault, and everybody was chuffed.
While Edward Shames had just been promoted to Staff Sergeant of the 101st Airborne ahead of the landings.
If you weren't scared, you were crazy. Of course, there were a lot of crazy guys, including me, but we were still frightened, I'm sure.
By 1944, the Allies had won the battle for air and naval supremacy. Now, US 8th and 9th Air Forces and Britain's 2nd Tactical Air Force stood by to support the landings, nearly 6,000 aircraft in total. From the sea, 5 battleships, 23 cruisers and 105 destroyers would bombard German defences before the assault craft landed. By spring 1944, there were 3 million Allied troops in Britain preparing for the invasion. Each division was given a designated staging area in southern England as vehicles, weapons and supplies poured in. Units earmarked for the invasion trained relentlessly, but details about the landings, codenamed Operation Neptune, remained top secret.
We never had any information at all. Where we were going, we didn't have any pictures of an L where we were going to land or anything at all. No information at all. All right, they might have given it to the officers, but we, other ranks, we never knew a damn thing.
While their own soldiers were kept in the dark, the Allies launched what's been called the greatest deception plan in history, to fool the Germans about the landing sites.
To deceive the Germans, the Allies set up Operation Fortitude. They created an entire fake army in England aimed at the French port of Calais. Calais was the closest deep water port in France to England, and it was a natural spot to invade. The Germans thought the Allies were coming to Calais, and Operation Fortitude convinced them of it.
Ken Sturdy, a veteran of Dunkirk, found himself at the heart of the ruse to deceive the Germans.
When we arrived there were dummy tanks made of rubber. There were dummy landing craft made of canvas and wood. All along the seafront at Dover were tents with big red cross painted on them to look like hospital tents. There were army signallers, RAF signallers. We deliberately aimed our antenna across the channel to Calais, and all the traffic, and it went on for about 2 weeks or so, we knew was phony, but it gave the impression there was very large contingent gathering ready for the invasion.
Eisenhower knew the Allied deception plan was crucial, because if the Germans were ready and waiting, D-Day could turn into a costly disaster, with tragic consequences for millions. On the evening of the 5th of June 1944, hundreds of Allied aircraft took off, bound for the Normandy coast. Operation Neptune, the Western Allies' invasion of Europe, was underway. In the first phase, 24,000 men, arriving by parachute and glider, would be dropped on both flanks of the invasion zone. The US 82nd and 101st and the British 6th Airborne Divisions were to seize key bridges, road junctions, and hold off German counterattacks. While shortly after dawn, US, British, and Canadian infantry divisions would land at 5 beaches along 50 miles of coast, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. When the beaches were secure, tanks and infantry would push inland, relieve the airborne troops, and prepare to resist the expected German counterattack. What paratroopers hadn't been told was that their units were expected to take 50% casualties. On the way in, they'd be highly vulnerable to German anti-aircraft fire. Carl Beck had lied about his age to join the army at 17. A year on, he was about to go into action for the first time.
We picked up 20mm fire as we came over the coast. You're at 800 feet above ground line, and that 20mm fire is vicious. If you're ever in an airplane that gets hit, and I hope you never are, it sounds like your head's in a bucket and somebody's pounding on the bucket.
As they neared their drop zones, heavily laden US paratroopers waited for the signal to jump.
We were ready for the green light, and we would get ready to shuffle out, and they had to shuffle because these guys, they could hardly walk getting out of that door because of the weight that they were carrying.
The airborne forces were to be dropped behind enemy lines, where they would be cut off from support, sometimes for several days. This meant they had to take everything with them.
Of course, the gear weighed about 150 pounds that I put on to get on that plane with the parachute. Everything we could possibly have, grenades, weapons, maps, the whole works. And some guys had mortars, 81mm mortar plates that they jumped with, machine guns, everything.
Taff Gillingham is an expert in the equipment of the ordinary soldier.
This is the uniform and equipment worn by the American airborne forces that jumped in Normandy in 1944. So they had a purpose-built jumpsuit designed specifically for the airborne forces. They carried gas masks with all the equipment that went with it. The chaps all carried these, which were anti-gas brassards. They were hooked on, this loop went through the shoulder strap, and they were painted with a special treatment so that in the event of poison gas being in the air, they'd turn red. So you would have an instant warning of poison gas. The equipment was the standard American fighting rig with ammunition pouches specifically depending on role. So in this case, these carried ammunition clips for the M1 Garand rifle. And this was actually a very good piece of kit because unlike most other armies who had bolt-action rifles, the M1 was semi-automatic. So what that meant was that you could fire 8 rounds straight off and then it would spit the clip out at the end while everybody else was still working their bolts. So the bayonet for the rifle, carried in a scabbard on the belt, was obviously for that moment when everything else was getting to the point when you'd run out of ammunition and you needed something just to finish the job.
The heavily encumbered airborne soldiers had now reached their jump points.
Our routine training called for us to get a 20-minute red light, but all we ever got was a bell. And a bell just means un-ass this airplane. So the jump master threw the bundle out, and out we went.
Have you ever been to one of these places where they have fireworks at night? Well, that's what we jumped in. As a matter of fact, you could hear the stuff and see the stuff going through your parachute because there were tracers all around.
We were going very fast, very low, 1.5 oscillations and slam into the water. So that was an exhilarating experience there to get us going.
John Marr was one of many who landed in fields flooded by the Germans. Dozens drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others dropped straight into German-held villages, where one American, according to an eyewitness, had a remarkable escape.
Dann ist der eine ja hängen geblieben am Kirchturm. Und hat sich dort gestellt und deswegen haben sie den nicht bemerkt. Ne?
Many who survived the jump landed miles from where they were supposed to be. John Marr made landfall around 2 a.m.
The first objective was to find my platoon and the equipment bundles and get organized and go fight as a platoon. That didn't happen. We were the worst scattered regiment in the entire drop of 2 divisions.
Things had gone better for the British 6th Airborne. On the invasion's east flank, in an extraordinary feat of glider piloting, a small detachment landed alongside 2 vital canal bridges and quickly captured them. Reinforcements then flew in to help defend these crossings against German counterattack. Glider pilot Bill Higgs made a dangerous approach into his landing zone.
The Germans weren't daft. They put posts in to stop us landing. And I hit one of them halfway through and the wing and knocked my right-hand starboard wing right off. But I was down all right, yeah.
Although the bridges were taken in a lightning assault, airborne troops were soon under pressure, defending against determined counterattacks. It was crucial they held out until the troops arriving by sea could reach them. Men now preparing to take on a formidable chain of beach defences, commanded by one of Germany's most brilliant generals. In the early hours of the 6th of June 1944, a furious aerial bombardment hammered the coast of northern France.
5 Kilometer von Falaise weg, da war dann inzwischen hell geworden und da sagte ich auf einmal, ach, guck mal da oben, was ist das dann? Da sahen wir Himmel und Flugzeuge kommen. Und auf einmal war an den Flugzeugen alles so kleine Stäbchen fielen da runter. Und da sag ich, was ist das dann? Ja, sagt einer, das ist eine Bombenteppich. Und dann haben wir das beobachten können, wie das ganze Falaise da zusammengehauen wurde.
Meanwhile, a vast Allied armada of more than 6,000 ships of all sizes was approaching the Normandy coast.
You could see the outline of the French coast, and I'm saying, my God, there's France. Wow, we're gonna be there, we're gonna go in.
It was pretty damned exciting, I say. I felt pretty good about the whole thing.
Hitler knew an Allied invasion was coming that summer, and that northern France was its most likely destination. Therefore, he'd entrusted its defense to one of his most brilliant and charismatic commanders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel won a reputation as one of Germany's most gifted generals during the defeat of France in 1940. While in North Africa, his cunning against the British won him the nickname the Desert Fox.
Erwin Rommel's one of the most famous German generals of World War II, and he was a spectacularly effective general in North Africa. His great strength was the ability to maneuver, to manipulate, and to move quickly before the enemy could react to what he was doing.
Rommel war für uns wie ein, ich möchte mal sagen, wie ein Vater. Der hatte ein Gefühl für seine Soldaten. Ne? Der war wirklich, also der war sehr, sehr jovial, ne? Sehr.
Rommel was famed for bold, aggressive action, but now he faced a very different challenge. With 2/3 of Germany's army on the Eastern Front, Rommel had to hold the Channel coast with 35 divisions, just 6 of which were in the vicinity of the Allied landing zone, 5 infantry divisions and the 21st Panzer Division. But many units were undermanned or considered unreliable.
They were either static divisions made up of old men or young men or Soviet deserters or other troops the Germans didn't quite trust, or units that had come from the Eastern Front, worn down by the fighting. Normandy was their rest and recuperation.
These units had one advantage, the so-called Atlantic Wall, a chain of coastal defences stretching in theory 2,000 miles from Norway to Spain. Hitler personally appointed Rommel to improve the Atlantic Wall defences in preparation for an invasion. Rommel believed that the only way to stop the Allied invasion was to hit it when it was most vulnerable, the moment of coming ashore. So he made strengthening beach defences his top priority. Under his watch, 3 times as many mines were laid, and 500,000 beach obstacles put in place. The number of heavy guns protected by covered concrete emplacements was also greatly increased. But in most places, the wall was far from the impregnable fortress of Nazi newsreels. As soldiers such as Hans Heinze found out.
Und vor der Küstenstraße war ein sogenannter Schützengraben. So nach der Manier angelegt, wie vielleicht zu Zeiten des alten Fritzen. So zack, zack, zack. 3/4 Meter tief allerhöchstens. Und so alle 20 Meter war irgendeine Stahl- oder Blechkuppel. Und dann sind wir da rein und da haben wir gesehen, in dem einen war ein belgisches MG, in dem anderen war ein tschechisches MG. Wir haben uns nicht die Zeit genommen, überhaupt festzustellen, ob da auch die nötige Munition dazu da war. Und vor diesem Schützengraben war ein Drahthindernis. Und aus irgendeinem Grund hatte mein Kommandeur damals lange Hosen an. Wir sind darüber, da hat sich die Hosen nicht zerrissen. Das war der Atlantikwall, den wir da kennengelernt hatten.
The most powerful German units in France were the armoured or panzer divisions. Rommel wanted these stationed on the coast, but he was only given 3. The rest were held back as part of a strategic reserve, which could only be used with Hitler's approval.
The 2 most important generals in the Western theater, von Schweppenberg and von Rundstedt, were reluctant to release the panzers and wanted to keep them as a mobile reserve near Paris. But Erwin Rommel had experienced Allied air power in North Africa, and he knew that keeping the reinforcements so far away from Normandy would mean that they would get cut to pieces when they did eventually try to move up to the front.
Allied soldiers tasked with breaching Rommel's new defences began transferring to landing craft. Rough weather, which had already forced Eisenhower to delay the invasion by 24 hours, made it a hazardous operation.
The boats were going up and down, you know, the big boat and the landing craft. So you had to watch yourself or you get your feet caught between the 2 boats and you get injured. And actually, some people fell in the water and drowned.
When we were lowered over the sides of the ship with davits and ropes, when the little boats hit the water, they were thrown around like matchsticks. The English Channel happened to be 15-foot waves on D-Day. So we were all soaked with the icy cold English Channel. And being that the LCAs had very low sides, the water was coming in, the bilge pumps could not get rid of the water. So we had to take off our steel helmets and bail out the water in order to stay afloat.
As dawn broke, Allied soldiers in the landing craft witnessed an awesome display of firepower to soften up the enemy.
The battleship started bombing, and I'm saying, my God, what is going on? This is incredible, guys. You know, I hope to God I live long enough to remember it so I can tell somebody about it.
Franz Goerkel, a soldier with 716th Infantry Division on Omaha Beach, had hoped this moment would never come.
Kam der Kamerad, der Wache hatte, und rief in den Bunker rein, Alarm, Alarm. Und dann haben wir uns umgedreht, haben den ausgeschimpft und haben gesagt, lass uns in Ruhe, wir wollen mal schlafen. Und dann dauert es nicht lange, kommt ein Unteroffizier von uns in den Bunker rein und brüllt dann richtig rein und schreit, Kerls, sagt er, jetzt wird's aber ernst.
The big guns were shooting the targets way far in, and all we could hear was a
Due to local tides, US landings began at 6:30 a.m., 1 hour ahead of the British and Canadians. At Utah, landing craft carrying troops of the US 4th Division landed in a weakly defended stretch of coastline and were soon advancing inland with just 197 casualties. But off Omaha, things quickly began to go wrong. Here, the beaches were held by experienced German troops from the 352nd Infantry Division, and the preparatory bombardments had failed to dislodge them. US bombers, nervous about hitting their own ships, dropped their bombs far inland and missed the beach entirely, while thousands of rockets fired from landing craft fell harmlessly into the sea.
Not one rocket shell fell among the dam or hit the beach line. They all dropped off into the water.
As the landing craft, carrying 1,450 men of the assault wave, neared the beach, they started taking heavy fire. The eastern half of the beach was assaulted by the battle-hardened 1st Division, the Big Red One.
When we came off of that boat, I lost one man alongside of him. My radio man was hit. I believe killed, because the radio itself, which was on his back, was hit, which means that the bullets would have had to come through him to get to the radio. I can remember looking at him, and as I stepped over him, and at that point, I didn't hesitate. I had already told the men, when the ramp went down, I turned around and yelled at my 2 squad leaders that were behind me, go straight in.
You could hit a machine gun bullets going off the ramp, you know, because the Germans were traversing like this, hitting all the boats coming in.
I didn't get but about 20 or 30 yards when the bullets were hitting around me on my feet, and there was an obstacle there that I made for, and I went down on one knee behind the obstacle for a short time, but just for seconds, because one bullet in one instance actually hit the steel.
The western half of the beach was assaulted by men of the untested 29th Division.
I was the 5th man on the left side of our little craft, behind Clarice Riggs of Pennsylvania, and he was gunned down on the ramp and went face down into the water. And I dove in behind him, and I was neck deep in bloody red water with my rifle over my head.
The Jerry's just opened up. They knew we were going to be there. They were waiting for us. And in effect, A Company and part of B Company were massacred right on the beach. There was nothing left of them.
Das waren ganz arme Kerls da unten, die Ersten. Die Ersten sind noch fast gar nicht, da ist fast gar keiner von durchgekommen. Überhaupt nicht, möchte man sagen. Da waren unsere Waffen, die waren ja noch alle in Ordnung, ne?
Don McCarthy's landing craft was swamped before it made the beach. He and his comrades had to swim for it.
When I went in the water, I went down head first in the water, but the air that was in the helmet pulled me back up top. I got my CO belt, I got rid of everything. All I've got on is my little 29th Division jacket, that's it. The combat jacket is gone, the rifle is gone, my camera's gone. I'm saying, son of a gun, my dad will kill me because I lost the camera. And I said, God, please, 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 get me off this beach and I'll do anything you want in my whole life if you just do this for me now. And the smoke came over. That was the miracle.
As GIs struggled to survive the first moments of the assault on Omaha Beach, they were desperately counting on tank support, in the form of specially modified Sherman tanks.
This amazing object is actually a DD Sherman tank. It's a tank that floated. The whole problem was, for the Allies to invade the German beaches, we were going to need tanks very, very quickly to support the infantry. If you put all your tanks in one landing craft and they go ashore and that landing craft is hit, they all get sunk. If you can spread the tanks out, let them float ashore, then you're spreading your risk. And so they developed the Sherman, and they call it the Sherman DD, duplex drive, using something called displacement. You put a canvas screen, like we've got on this model here, around the outside of the vehicle, and it actually displaces enough water that you can float a 30-ton Sherman tank. The idea being the tracks can take you across the land, but in the water, they actually add propellers to the back of the vehicle to take it through the water and get onto the beach. For the Germans, there's accounts of them thinking these tanks, as they're coming to shore, are just canvas boats. And suddenly that screen drops and there's a 75mm gun of a Sherman tank pointing at them. And so that fear factor and the shock factor as well of those tanks coming ashore has an impact on the German defenders.
On Omaha, American commanders insisted on launching the DD tanks 3 miles out, into rougher seas than anything they'd trained for. The consequences were disastrous.
The water would come up to roughly where that black line is, and it's got about a 3-foot freeboard. It was considered safe to go in waves of up to a foot high, but nothing much higher.
27 out of 29 tanks sank in 6-foot waves. And with only 2 of the tanks making it to shore, whole squads of infantry were mown down as they tried to cross 80 yards of open beach. With US troops at Omaha pinned down and taking heavy casualties, at 0730 hours, British and Canadian landings began at Gold, Juno and Sword. Royal Marine Commando Vincent Horton, who had already dodged bombs and bullets in Italy and Africa, knew only too well the dangers that lay ahead.
You never expect to survive. You always take the assumption that the first in are going to take the casualties.
As the landing craft began their approach, the success of Operation Neptune hung in the balance. Another disaster like Omaha, and the entire invasion could be headed towards catastrophe.
I see a boat get a direct hit, and you can see all the bodies going up in the air, and I don't think anyone lived out of that lot.
As the first wave of British and Canadian soldiers approached the shores of Normandy, they ran a gauntlet of artillery fire, beach obstacles, and anti-tank mines.
My craft hit an obstacle out in the water, and it blew the whole front of the landing craft up in the air, and I was towards the back, thank God. There was nothing but water pouring in, and guys up in the front, they were all done for. That was it for them. They were game over.
British and Canadian troops thrown into the sea were encumbered not just by kit, but by their uniforms.
The soldiers all had this rough, hairy serge battle dress uniform, very hard-wearing wool. It was virtually waterproof in a rainstorm. Obviously, if you waded ashore, you'd be soaking wet, but the whole thing was great because it dried off as you moved around. You heated it up from the inside out. For D-Day itself, some of the troops were issued with what was called the 1942 battle jerkin. The intention of the designer was to have a one-piece garment that the soldiers could literally carry everything in one piece of kit. Every soldier was wearing this very, very simple life belt, which was worn around the neck and tied around the waist, and they would then have the thing half inflated so that it already had a bit of air in, and if when you came off the landing craft you're in deep water and you got in trouble, you could then eject your fighting equipment and inflate this to actually keep you afloat until you managed to get ashore.
But many men made a basic error with fatal consequences.
Their life-saving apparatus, which they had round them, was quite often round their waist instead of being under their armpits. And because of the weight of their packs and ammunition and things they carried, sometimes they got in deep water and they would just turn over and drown.
Troops that made it to the beach were under strict orders to keep moving.
If you join, particularly an infantry unit, 30, 40 of you in a platoon, you're brothers. You are friends, you are brothers, and if one of you gets hit, your instinct is to help, but your orders were to run on and leave him. It's quite a tough thing to do, to leave your friend laying there.
The scenes on Omaha are synonymous with the Normandy landings. But in contrast, many British and Canadian units faced much lighter defences and were able to get ashore relatively unscathed. Crucially, unlike at Omaha, many DD tanks made it to shore.
We
launched into shallow-ish water. When we went off the ramp, the screen was fully up, you see. And so we were going through, avoiding the hedgehogs, which were these iron stanchions with a 75mm German shell on the top, or a mine. And so we had to weave our way through those, motoring along on the bottom.
Like the DD, other specialised tanks were used to bust through German beach defences. Amongst them, the Crab.
This is the Sherman Crab, and the idea here is on the front of a standard Sherman tank, these boom arms have been led forward with a drum on. The drum rotates at about 142 revolutions a minute, and it spins metal chains. There's 43 of them here, and they beat the ground and blow up mines ahead of the vehicle as it goes forward.
When they landed, everybody was doing their own thing. The beach master was trying to set up his post to control the beach. The flail tank was getting on with getting rid of the mines, and the stretcher bearers were picking up the dead. Everybody had a little job to do, and that was the marvellous thing.
Meanwhile, at Omaha, survivors of the first two waves were still pinned down on the beach. One problem was that most of their equipment was at the bottom of the sea.
They lost guns, they lost equipment, they lost Bangalore torpedoes, which was one of the biggest losses. Because without Bangalore torpedoes, we couldn't get through the barbed wire.
A Bangalore torpedo was a 5-foot section of pipe filled with TNT that could be screwed to another section to create a pole. This could then be pushed under barbed wire to blow a path through. Sergeant Reynolds found himself alongside one of the few men on the beach still carrying his torpedo.
He gets to the top of the shingle bank, and he slides it across the top of the shingle bank where the barbed wire was. The man took the second section of the Bangalore, clipped the two of them together, stuck a fuse into the end of the Bangalore, pulled the cord, which was the igniter, and got back away from the torpedo. And after 5 seconds, it didn't go off. So anyway, he crawls right back up without any hesitation, takes the bad fuse ladder out, puts another one in, look back to see if he can back up, pulled the fuse ladder and started backward, and only made just one little shove backwards. But he was killed by either machine gun or rifle fire before the Bangalore went off. My face is this close to his, and he's looking right into my eye when he died. And he died by just, he had a look in his face that, to me, at the time, was pretty much like surprise. And he just closed his eyes and dropped his head. Now, this all happened in about 5 seconds' time, and then the Bangalore torpedo went off. Of course, it blew a hole, and I was up immediately and through that barbed wire.
Harley Reynolds was the first man in his sector to make it through the wire and up the bluffs. Along the beach, small groups of men fought their way out of the killing zone and onto the ridge that overlooked the beach. One inspirational figure that morning was the 29th Division's Assistant Commander, Brigadier General Dutch Cotta. Norman Dutch Cotta was a career soldier and West Point graduate who preferred to be in the field with his men than sat behind a desk. On D-Day, he came ashore at Omaha with the second wave, and at 51 may well have been the oldest man on the beach. As an amphibious warfare expert, he'd warned that Omaha would be tough. Seeing the chaos that had engulfed the first wave, Cotta rallied survivors and personally led a charge through the wire to restore momentum. In some sectors, Navy destroyers came to the rescue, blasting German positions from close range.
The only thing that saved us was this U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Frankfurt, came in real close without running aground and started banging away at the hill. The skipper saw puffs of smoke. He figured it was machine guns firing. So he suppressed the fire up on the top of the hill. And that's what allowed us to get through the exit and get on up the hill.
US troops were in no mood for mercy. Although grievously wounded, Hal Baumgarten had fought his way into the German defenses.
We got to a machine gun nest with about 5 Germans in it, and they were holding our advance off. These guys wanted to surrender, but we had one Ranger with us, and he had his submachine gun, and he emptied his submachine gun into these Germans. I wouldn't fire at anybody like that, but this Ranger was so, he had lost so much men on the beach, he just went wild.
On each landing beach, Navy officers were tasked with keeping the invasion moving.
The way that man was acting, he was cool as a cucumber, just standing there, shit. Come on, get off the beach, get off. And chasing him off the beach as though he was in the middle of the road or school crossing.
As units did start moving inland, German strongpoints, snipers and minefields slowed the advance to a crawl. On the invasion's western flank, American units advancing from Utah made contact with airborne forces. For Lieutenant Frank Gregg and his platoon of paratroopers, it was just in time to lend much-needed assistance.
I heard tank coming up behind me. I looked back and it was one of our tanks that had gotten coming over the beach. So the lieutenant rolled his tank up there and he yelled down at me, "Hey, Lieutenant, I got 30 minutes of fuel left in this thing. What can I do to help you?" I said, "You see that road junction right up there where that firing is coming from?" He said, "Yes." I said, "That is my colonel wants me to capture that road junction and hold it. So if you could help us out, sure appreciate it." He says, "Okay." He says, "I'll throw a 75 millimeter shell in there and should quiet them down." So I said, "Good." He cut loose a 75, it went bang right into the position.
With each hour that passed, the Allied foothold in France became more secure as reinforcements poured ashore from landing craft and ships. The feared German counterattack had yet to materialize. But German panzers were finally on the move, their orders to drive the Allies back into the sea. Rommel had insisted that the Allies had to be defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours. But no major German counterattack had yet been launched. Disastrously, Rommel himself was on leave in Germany, having been assured by weather experts that an invasion was impossible that week. As he raced back to France by car, the German Panzer Reserve sat idle all morning, because the only man who could authorize its use, the Führer, remained wary of Allied intentions.
The main reason that people always hear, and that you can find in every literature and in a lot of films, is the fact that Hitler slept through the attack and no one dared wake him up because he was a man who liked to sleep very long. There is some truth to that. However, there are also pure military reasons as to why the counterattack hadn't launched. The main reason for that is that the Germans were actually still expecting a second bigger and major invasion somewhere in the Pas-de-Calais area. So because of that, they kept back their strategic reserve because they regarded in the early hours of the D-Day landings, the D-Day landings only as a diversionary attack.
At the high command level, at Rommel's level and farther up, the Germans spent the whole day dithering about what to do and let go a prime opportunity to drive the Allies back into the sea.
It was left to General Marx, commanding the 84th Infantry Corps in Normandy, to take charge of the situation. General Erich Marx was a highly skilled staff officer who'd taken part in the German invasions of Poland and France and helped plan Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. As a division commander on the Eastern Front, he'd lost a leg in combat, but remained in the army, winning promotion to General of Artillery. And in 1943, being given command of the 84th Infantry Corps in Normandy. D-Day, the 6th of June, happened to be his 53rd birthday. Marx ordered his strongest available reserve, the 21st Panzer Division, to make a counterattack. His final words to its officers: "If you don't succeed in throwing the British back into the sea, we shall have lost the war."
In this situation, General Marx unleashed 21st Panzer Division. The 21st Panzer Division was his iron fist that he had in the Normandy area. The other German divisions were all of particularly low quality, one or two exceptions perhaps, but the other reserves were about 120 kilometers behind the beaches, and it would take some time to bring these up to engage in the fighting, not least because of attacks by French partisans, also by attacks by the Allied Air Force, so they understood these things would take time.
At 4 p.m, lead units of the British 3rd Division advancing from Sword Beach through woods and hedgerows reported German tanks on the move. At this stage, the greatest threat came from the workhorse of the German armoured divisions, the Panzer IV.
The Panzer IV is a hugely effective tank, and they make over 8,500 of them during the course of the war. It starts its life as being an infantry support vehicle designed with a short-barreled 75mm gun, but Hitler insists it has a long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm gun fitted to it. Very effective for knocking out enemy tanks, and the other great thing about the Panzer IV is they were able to upgrade it when it was in service. One of the reasons the Panzer IV was considered such a successful and well-designed tank was about the crew ergonomics. If we look inside, the commander's position is actually right in the middle of the turret. And he's actually got an eye line on one side to his loader, who's loading that 75mm gun, and on the other side to the gunner, who's actually doing the aiming and firing of the gun. He can actually just about see through to the front of the tank, where we've got the driver and the radio operator. And why that's important, in the stress of battle, if you talk to veterans, that idea of a wink, a smile, a firm order at the right time, a calming voice, that can be just as important as the technology that you've got around you.
The 21st Panzer Division launched its attack, but quickly ran into heavy fire from British tanks and anti-tank guns. By 9 p.m, a handful of Germans had fought their way to the Channel coast, just in time for an awesome spectacle. A vast air armada approaching from the sea, 250 Dakotas, towing as many gliders. This was Operation Mallard, the arrival of the British 6th Air Landing Brigade to reinforce the earlier airborne landings.
Out to sea, the sky was black with aircraft, as they say, and you could see there would look like hundreds of planes coming in towing gliders. And as we set off, the gliders started coming down. A couple of them would burst through this hedge at the side of the right-hand side of the road.
As gliders began landing behind them, the German units retreated back towards Caen to avoid being cut off. As D-Day came to an end, exhausted frontline troops slept where they could, in scraped trenches or alongside their vehicles.
It was a strange first night on D-Day because we didn't attack anybody and nobody attacked us, at least in my case.
I say to myself, son of a gun, we actually made it. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm really in France. I'm here. I made it.
We finished flailing in that field, and we just rolled up in our blankets and went to sleep.
By the end of D-Day, the Allies had gained a vital foothold on the French coast. though they had failed to reach several key objectives, including the city of Caen. But crucially, 160,000 British, Canadian and US troops were safely ashore, and in the days to come, that figure doubled. Over 5 days, more than 54,000 vehicles and 100,000 tons of supplies were also landed. But the human cost was high. It's been estimated that on that first day, there were around 3,000 British and Canadian casualties, and 6,500 American, about half of them at Omaha Beach. The number of German losses is unknown, but it's estimated that there were between 4,000 and 9,000 German casualties on that fateful day. Though the Allies were short of their objectives, it was clear that Operation Neptune had been an overwhelming success. In crossing the Channel and breaching the Atlantic Wall in a single day, the Allies had overcome the greatest obstacle standing between them and Nazi Germany. But for all the horror and heroism, D-Day was the first day in a bloody 3-month battle for Normandy, and only the beginning of a long and grueling road to victory in Europe. Following the enormous success of D-Day, Allied forces faced a bitter struggle for the French city of Caen.
When the 3rd British tried to capture Caen in Operation Mitten, they were slaughtered.
I knew it was me already. And when you're like that, you don't think the bullets actually were whipping past my euro, I can tell you.
A battle that would descend into weeks of bloody, attritional fighting. A living hell for soldiers on the front line.
Da ging ein Kampf, ich glaube, über 14 Tage mit fast täglichem Wechsel des Besitzers dieser Höhe 112.
One of the toughest battles in France. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the experience.
June 1944, and Hitler's Germany was on the back foot. In Russia, it had suffered disastrous defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, and now struggled to hold back Stalin's Red Army. In Italy, the Germans had abandoned Rome and were retreating north. While in northern France, on D-Day, the 6th of June, Allied forces had opened the long-awaited Second Front, fighting their way ashore at Normandy in the largest operation in military history. Now, the region's capital, Caen, became the focus of a gigantic slugging match between Allied and German forces. For the Allies, Caen was the key to breaking out of Normandy, but was proving a hard nut to crack.
Taking of Caen was a very important part of the operation, because by holding the town, you held the main routes in and out of Normandy, rail and road.
Edwin Bramall was a 20-year-old infantry officer during the Battle of Normandy, who went on to become the head of British armed forces.
All our fighting, to begin with, was in sight of Caen, really, and which we'd hoped to get the first day, but it didn't work out like that.
Bruce Melanson from Nova Scotia had lied about his age so he could be sent overseas with his unit in 1940.
Montgomery and Churchill and then our own generals at that particular time, they informed us that we were to take Caen in 2 weeks. It took us almost 2 months.
The killing fields of Normandy were the first experience of combat for thousands of Allied soldiers, often pitched against elite German units in a costly struggle to break their resistance. As a young officer, Patrick Delaforce commanded a troop of 4 self-propelled artillery guns in Normandy.
Everybody put a brave face on it because we knew it was a war of attrition, that with a bit of luck, if one of our chaps were being killed, with a bit of luck, maybe one of the Germans was being killed.
With the Germans rapidly sending reinforcements to Normandy, the Allies now had to quickly build up their own forces, fight off the expected German counterattack, and launch their assault on Caen. The task fell to commander of Allied land forces in Normandy, General Bernard Montgomery. Popularly known as Monty, Britain's foremost general of the Second World War was a supremely professional and precise commander, who distinguished himself early in the war by getting his division out of Dunkirk almost unscathed. Rapid promotion followed, and in 1942, Monty was given command of British and Commonwealth forces in North Africa, where he decisively defeated Rommel's Afrika Korps. A prickly character who many found unbearably arrogant, he was nonetheless popular with his men.
Montgomery was an extremely capable commander with a massive ego who had the habit, particularly after the war, of saying that he could pre-plan all his battles perfectly and the enemy never had any say in it. He just carried out his master plan. The way the Battle of Normandy was fought, once the initial landings were over, Montgomery focused entirely on the British and Canadian side, and he left the Americans, good alliance politics, to fight their own battle.
While US First Army under General Omar Bradley slowly fought its way through Normandy hedgerows on the Allied right flank, Monty began planning the capture of Caen. For the Battle of Caen, Montgomery would rely on Lieutenant General Dempsey's British Second Army. Initially, it had just the divisions that landed on D-Day. But more troops were landing in Normandy every day, including Monty's North Africa veterans, the 51st Highland and the famous 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats. Monty's men could also count on fire support from Royal Navy warships in the Channel, including the heavy guns of HMS Rodney and HMS Roberts. And thanks to the Allies' complete air superiority over Normandy, there would be close air support from bombers and fighter bombers. The Allies were currently stalled 4 miles short of Caen. Canadian attempts to take the city by frontal attack had been repelled by the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. So Montgomery ordered a pincer attack to squeeze Caen from the east with an attack by the 51st Highland Division towards Unveils, and the west with an attack spearheaded by 7th Armoured towards Tilly-sur-Seulles. He had high hopes his North Africa veterans would soon secure Caen for the Allies. But 7th Armoured's advance soon ran into the difficult Normandy countryside, known as bocage, a labyrinth of sunken lanes and hedgerows. The Desert Rats were one of the few units equipped with the new British Cromwell tank.
There is a little tendency to judge tanks as if they're always fighting other tanks. And the Cromwell is never compared to something like a Panther as if it's an equal match. But it's fast, it's got the Meteor engine in the back. It's got Christie suspension, which means it's a very smooth ride. And it's actually got the relatively powerful 75mm gun on it. Now, one of the issues of the Cromwell is we could call a design fault. As you look at the vehicle, the driver has a hatch above his head, but if the turret is turned, firing, it can close over that hatch. And if the gun or the vehicle is hit, that means that the driver can't get out.
As 7th Armoured approached Tilly-sur-Seulles, they ran into units of the Panzer Lehr Division, an elite unit drawn from armoured warfare instructors that had just arrived in Normandy.
It's as if you look at the map afterwards, I have done it, as if he drew a line across the map and said, you've got this far, if you go any further you're going to fight. And by golly did we fight. And we went into Tilly-sur-Seulles and we did fight, and that was our first real combat situation. I think they had 25 goes at that before they eventually took Tilly-sur-Seulles. It was a hell of a fight. 12th Panzer Lehr were there.
They were not easy to deal with. They would put sticky bombs on
tanks and things like that if I had half a chance. But I was troop leader for regimental headquarters, so I was further back. And the C Squadron was in front of us, and one of their troops turned sideways down a hedge at right angles, and every tank was knocked out. I saw them a week or two later, and they still had bits of people inside.
The point I've often made to my friends who were there on D-Day, when you got there was no Germans there. They didn't expect you, but they was expecting us, and they had tanks and God knows what else, you see.
I hit the deck, and the bloke walking near me must have taken a direct hit because his hands landed in front of me. As I hit the deck, a hand landed with me. The whole arm landed with me, and I screamed my head off.
Experienced German troops fought the British to a standstill. But the situation changed on the 12th of June. Attacks by the US 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions on the British right flank found a gap in the German line. 7th Armoured Division advanced through the hole, making for Villers-Bocage, in an attempt to encircle Caen from the southwest. As British tanks arrived in the village of Villers-Bocage, French civilians came out to welcome them and celebrate the end of 4 years of occupation.
And we came in, beautiful day. People came out on the streets with flowers and cider and Calvados. And we thought, this is great, no sign of any Germans.
I wasn't particularly worried myself because the French people said, no, there's no German tanks actually in Villers-Bocage, it's all in Tracy-Bocage and the other villages around. So we went through the town quite quickly, and they told us, close up. And so I was only about 20, 30 yards behind the colonel's tank.
But the French villagers were wrong, and their celebrations were premature.
We'd been told to expect 30% casualties at D-Day, but we didn't get them till Villers-Bocage.
Unbeknownst to John Cloudsley Thompson and his squadron, they decided to pause the advance right next door to a company of the 101st SS Heavy Tank Battalion, which was now approaching rapidly from the east.
I was rather busy looking at the map and trying to work out what was happening. And then, very suddenly, the tank in front of me burst into flames with a big explosion.
Their column had been ambushed by one of Germany's feared Tiger heavy tanks.
I saw this tank coming. It moved the 88mm just like that, then wham! And the shot came, and I was standing up in the turret looking through the periscope. I ducked down, and I felt a tingling between my legs. I thought, well, lucky my legs were apart, because I knew that the shot must have gone between.
In command of the 55-ton steel monster was a Waffen-SS legend, Obersturmführer Michael Wittman.
He earns his reputation on the Eastern Front, and he's an absolute gift to the German propaganda machine. Wittman's Tigers are in France in the summer of 1944, and after the D-Day landings, they are moved up to try and block British advances around Caen. As part of the advance, the British 7th Armoured Division races forward to capture high ground around the village of Villers-Bocage. Now, Wittman's Tigers have just been offloaded, and they're resting very near that village. As soon as Wittman hears that the British 7th Armoured are parked up on the side of the road, he attacks, and he knocks out many British vehicles.
Wittman's 15-minute rampage through the town of Villers-Bocage knocked out 13 British tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 other armoured vehicles.
And that was actually pretty horrifying because you could see tanks being blown up, and then you think, well, it could be me next time, but then you have to dismiss that from your mind because that's the way life goes.
Wittman's Tiger was eventually disabled by an anti-tank gun, but by then, the damage was done.
We'd lost half the regiment in that one day in Villers-Bocage. which is really disastrous.
German news services quickly leapt on Wittman's success.
Now, the German propaganda machine immediately inflates this victory. He's interviewed on German radio that very evening. This inflates the reputation of Michael Wittman and, of course, the Tiger tank. In actual fact, that battle was much more of a draw, and Wittman had lost precious German assets, Tiger tanks, that could not easily be replaced.
The following night, the British returned to Villers Bocage, when 300 heavy bombers unleashed devastation on the village and strategic crossroads.
We saw a lot of bombers coming over and clouds of smoke in the distance and masses of these British bombers coming over to bomb Villers Bocage. And that's when it became the most heavily bombed town in Normandy, or anyway in the British sector during the war ever. It was very, very badly smashed.
The Allies could take some comfort from the fact they'd not had to face these powerful German armoured forces on D-Day itself. Army Group B commander Erwin Rommel had wanted these elite units stationed on the coast, ready to smash the Allied invasion on the beaches. But he'd been overruled by Adolf Hitler, who insisted the prized panzer divisions be held back as a reserve and used only with his explicit authority. Under the Third Reich, Hitler wielded complete power over the military as both Armed Forces Supreme Commander and Army Commander-in-Chief. He had no formal training as a tactical commander or officer and never rose beyond the rank of corporal during the Great War, but from 1940 onwards began to interfere more and more in military affairs.
By 1944, Hitler had certainly gotten very untrusting of the German high command, and he wanted to make sure that they were doing what he wanted them to do. That meant things like giving out stand-fast orders where he refused to allow German forces to retreat, telling cities to hold at all costs no matter what the Allies did, and generally getting down to a much lower level than the leader of Germany should have been getting.
Hitler only allowed Rommel 3 panzer divisions to place along the coast. The rest were held back for a decisive counterattack once it was clear where the main Allied invasion was heading. But on D-Day, Hitler's order came too late for the Panzer Reserve to reach the Normandy beaches. So on D-Day itself, the Caen sector was defended by just one weak infantry division of 7th Army, with 21st Panzer Division as a local reserve. But within 24 hours, reinforcements began to arrive from the 1st SS Panzer Corps, and 3 weeks later, from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. These powerful formations were well equipped and highly motivated.
The showcase divisions included a number of divisions of the Waffen-SS. This was the Nazi Party's private army, independent, at least in structure and organization, of the German army. The Waffen-SS formed from originally what had been the SS, the people who stood as guards for Hitler when he was speaking in the 1930s, and they had grown up by 1944 into a force of about 30 divisions around the world. Fighting in Normandy were two of the most remarkable of the German divisions. The 1st SS Panzer, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler's bodyguard. These were men who were highly committed Nazis and very effective troops indeed, and the division that was spun off from the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, the 12th SS Division Hitler Jugend.
When the Hitler Youth Division was formed in late 1943, they were looking for experienced officers and non-commissioned officers to build the cadre around which they would build this particular division. The ranks and files would then be filled by very young men, and that's why it's called the Hitler Youth Division. So a lot of people were, well, around the age of 18, some of them even younger. And most of these experienced cadres came from the 1st SS Panzer Division. So there was a bit of a relationship between the two divisions.
They were Führertreu, they were true to the Führer, and their commitment to Hitler and their fighting abilities were second to none. At the same time, that same commitment made them much more likely to shoot prisoners or kill civilians.
Now facing the cream of Hitler's army, it was more vital than ever that the Allies move reinforcements and supplies rapidly from ships to beaches and then to the front line. To achieve this, they'd set up a hugely sophisticated operation involving thousands of ships, landing craft and amphibious vehicles, as well as 2 giant artificial harbours, codenamed Mulberry A and B. A week after D-Day, the Allies were landing 30,000 troops and 7,000 vehicles every day. But freak weather was about to throw Allied plans into chaos. On the 19th of June, the worst storm to hit Normandy in 40 years tore through the Channel.
June was selected as being the perfect month for the Normandy invasion. It turned out to be almost disastrous. The American harbour on the other side of Armagh broke up, so that was of no use. These massive concrete blocks that the harbour was made of were just tossed around by the seas.
The storm wrecked 800 ships and landing craft, 5 times as many as were lost during the actual D-Day assault.
You have to realise that a 3,500-ton flat-bottomed landing craft, it's a bit like a shoebox. You put it on the water and you blow at it and it will go anywhere. And an LSC of that size, it got blown, and we got well blown.
The beaches were strewn with wreckage and took days to clear.
The consequence of this particular storm was that Allied logistics was thrown into disarray. The logistical resupply of the Allied forces after the storm is down by 50%. And this, of course, gives the Germans, you might argue, a bit of a breathing space. Of course, the Allies still have a sheer superiority in man and material, but if they had had both of these Mulberry harbours, things would have been even worse for the Germans.
The storm forced Montgomery to postpone a new offensive against Caen by 5 days. He knew it could prove a costly delay, since according to top-secret intelligence, the enemy were about to receive major reinforcements.
The Germans had what they believed was an unbreakable code that they could use to communicate. They used something called the Enigma machine, which looked like an oversized typewriter. But one of those Enigma machines had actually fallen into the hands of Polish intelligence during the German invasion of Poland in 1939, and the Poles got it to the British. Once they got the machine, the British code-breaking unit at Bletchley Park worked 24/7 to break the German codes and make sure that they could read German messages. For General Montgomery, what Ultra allowed him to do in the battle for Caen was understand what German units were arriving in the defensive lines and how he should respond to them.
Monty was determined to press ahead with his new offensive before German reinforcements entered the battle. The attack, codenamed Operation Epsom, began with a monstrous barrage by 700 guns, including the heavy guns of 4 Royal Navy warships firing at a range of more than 10 miles.
I've seen one Tiger tank that was hit by one of the shells from the Warspite. It was turned over rather like a dinky toy, but that was very rare.
Bombardments by both sides were steadily laying waste to the Norman countryside. Hundreds of farm animals were caught in the crossfire, their carcasses left to fester in the summer heat.
That's one of the worst things I can remember, really. And that was really disgusting. But, you couldn't help yourself. You didn't move. You had to keep under cover. But you might have 4 or 5 dead cows in the field. There's nothing to scarce you the smell of death.
In the wake of the massive bombardment, 2 fresh divisions from British 8th Corps, supported by nearly 600 tanks, would attack south, cross the Odon River, and swing round to encircle Caen. Supporting attacks would be made by the Canadian 3rd Division at Carpiquet Airfield and 49th West Riding Division towards Roré. But But the Germans had organized a skillful defense in depth, and casualties were high.
We had to go through countryside. There was open fields. So the snipers were having a ball. You know, they was knocking mainly officers, because then, when they first landed, they had their pips up and their revolver, and, you know, it was obvious officers, so we came and get the officer. And they were shooting them. We had to finish up with one officer.
So there was a lot of fire about, tremendous lot of fire, anti-tank fire, artillery fire. The 15th Scottish Division had a very difficult battle. They lost 250 men in the first hour. We ourselves got shelled a lot, and we also first met this awful weapon, the naval Werfer, which is a smoke thrower, and it's called the Moaning Minnie, and that produced this awful humming sound. And then all these mortar bombs covered an area about the size of a football field. Luckily, you had this warning. So as soon as you heard this awful moaning noise, you took what cover you could in a ditch or in a trench or something like that.
The supporting attack at Roré also ran into fierce opposition.
And we took a couple of villages and we did 3 attacks, and each one of them was large casualties, as all the attacks in Normandy were. And we were pushed back just as soon as we went forward. If you made a gain of 100 yards, that was a major victory, because fighting was beginning to become so terribly intense. And our first 3 attacks, we lost a lot of people.
It took 2 days of grueling combat to get across the Odon River. Then, on the far bank, they faced a battle for a long, low ridge that soon became infamous. Hill 112.
It was the highest point on a series of rolling downland, and it was called 112 simply because it was 112 feet above sea level. It was in a commanding position overlooking the city of Caen, which you could see quite clearly.
Rommel himself said that whoever held Hill 112 held Normandy. We was in the 15th Scottish Division, which was at the side of the hill, and that was known as the Scottish Corridor. And before it was named Death Valley. We was losing there 150 men a day.
Time and again, British soldiers were ordered to advance across open wheat fields, just waiting for dug-in German machine gun crews to open up with one of their most feared weapons.
Because the Germans had been there much, much longer than we'd been there, they had proper positions that were mainly guarded properly with sandbags and what have you, so they were difficult to get rid of. And their machine guns was knocking our blokes out right, left and centre.
The British were up against the devastating MG42, nicknamed Hitler's Zipper.
The German MG42 light machine gun was typical of the German design. Heavily over-engineered, beautifully made, and used an enormous amount of bullets. It was a very feared weapon, there's no doubt about that. Allied soldiers remembered the sound of it. It was just like the sound of tearing paper.
There's no machine gun that fires like an MG42. It's a brip, brip, brip.
Like a string of Chinese firecrackers going off next to your ear. That's at once, and and they're very rapid.
You have no options. Once it starts, you've got it. You either get hit or you don't get hit, one or the other.
But the MG42's extraordinary rate of fire had its drawbacks.
It fired 1,200 rounds a minute, twice the rate of anything that the British used. And the problem with that is that the more bullets you fire, the more bullets you need to make, the more you need to supply, the more you need to transport, the more you need to carry into action.
War ein luftgekühltes Maschinengewehr, das theoretisch in der Minute 3000 Schuss schießen konnte. Das war aber technisch nicht möglich, weil niemand in der Lage war, diese 3000 Schuss in einer Minute vorzuhalten. Es gab 3 MG-Schützen, der das MG hatte, und dann 2, die nur die Munition trugen. Die hatten in so Kästen, und da waren vielleicht 200 drin in jedem Kasten, und jeder konnte 2 Kästen schleppen. Und Sie können sich vorstellen, Bis da 200 Schuss raus waren, da braucht man schon ein bisschen Zeit. Also das mit der Minute war Theorie.
In 4 bloody days of attack and counterattack, British 8th Corps suffered 4,000 casualties. British Sherman tanks occupied the forward slopes of Hill 112, but then, astoundingly, they were pulled back.
And they got up to the top, which was a brilliant operation. And then, like the Duke of York's army, they were told to come down again, and nobody ever knew why. And the answer was that Bletchley Park's Ultra had told Montgomery that 2 powerful SS armoured divisions, panzer divisions, were coming up from the south, and that if we'd stayed up there, the whole division, 11, would have been cut off. And Monty didn't dare risk us at that early stage, so we came down again.
Montgomery therefore took the decision to pull back slightly from the upper slopes of Hill 112 to the next safe position. When the attack up what is called the Roré Spur occurred, the British were waiting for it, and they halted it with heavy German casualties. Montgomery was ready for them. That's the difference Ultra made.
The SS Panzer Division's counterattack was shattered by overwhelming Allied firepower. Anti-tank and artillery guns, and strafing attacks by fighter bombers. But despite this, the Allies' swift advance through Normandy had hit an impasse, and Monty couldn't afford to lose momentum. What happened next was to be one of the most controversial episodes of the Normandy campaign. Caen was still in German hands. Montgomery's first 2 attempts to take the city by envelopment had failed. In July, he decided to send British 1st Corps straight up the middle. Ahead of the assault, codenamed Operation Charnwood, 467 bombers pulverized the northern approaches to the city.
I watched the terrific aerial bombardment of Caen, but very close. I mean, I could feel the whole ground. I saw the bombers coming over and feel the whole ground shake. And, we were very close to the bombing.
1 or 2 got hit by anti-aircraft fire, I suppose, and 1 was damaged, but at least he got down. And we all rushed up the hill to see if we could help. But he said, keep away, we've still got bombs on board. So we all ran back down the hill again.
It was blown to bits, Caen was. We always wondered why we'd bombed it so heavy, because when you bomb a place, it makes terrific hiding for infantry, and it makes your job worse and worse.
German positions were then blasted by the 16-inch guns of HMS Rodney, as well as the 6-inch guns of cruisers HMS Belfast and Emerald. Then strafed by RAF Typhoons.
And we had a real view of the Typhoons going into action. And what we saw from where we were on the plains overlooking it. And we could see the Typhoons going in with their rockets, firing on the Tigers from behind. Mind, the fire they were receiving, anti-aircraft fire, was terrific. You know, as Morrow said, they ever got through it.
They did such a wonderful job, those Typhoons. Used to watch them coming, zoom, holy mackerel. Really made you shiver a little bit because of the fact they knew that the enemy was down there, accepting all this, you know.
British and Canadians slowly fought their way through German-held villages into the outskirts of Caen.
Between the coast and Caen, there were about 7 or 8 fortified villages where the Germans had fortified everything and based large numbers of artillery guns, field guns, anti-tank guns. And Garmanche was one of these fortified villages. And we fought twice at Garmanche, and we had one day where we were without infantry, where our infantry had lost so heavily, the colonel pulled the rest of them, or their colonel pulled them out from there. And B Squadron, my squadron of tanks, was in there one day, and we were static. The Germans were on the high ground in the village looking down on us and could see everything that was happening. And every time we moved, they were shelling us, and they were shelling us continuously for a period of about 4 or 5 hours when we were without infantry. And we had orders to hold it and not to pull back. So we had to literally sit there and be shot at.
A mortar come over, the most devastating blast I ever heard in my life. It landed right between Alec Duncan's legs. He was the one in the middle. I don't remember anything that happened, except for a few minutes later, Harold Burden, which was on the left of Alec Duncan, said, "How you doing, Hook?" I said, "I don't know. I don't know how I'm doing." I said, "How's Alec doing?" He says, "Alec is dead. He'd lost both his legs. Both his legs."
On the right of the advance, in house-to-house fighting through the ruins of Caen, the Canadians were again facing die-hard fanatics of the Hitler Youth Division. And rumours were circulating of a massacre of Canadian prisoners.
In this Battle of Caen, we were up against Hitler's toughest troops, the SS troops under General Kurt Meyer. And he's the jerk that killed 24 of our Canadians in the Abbey. He murdered them.
Kurt Meyer, seen here, was convicted after the war by a Canadian court for his part in the murder of Canadian prisoners during the battle.
Well, I'm still mad about it. I still feel that they didn't fight fair. I mean, there's a right and a wrong way to fight a war, and sure, get killed in action or shoot somebody, and not necessarily after he's taken prisoner. That's wrong. That is very wrong. Well, I don't forgive and forget. I just put it in the back of my mind and say, that's the way they were, and they'll. we're not going to change history now.
Fighting around Caen assumed new levels of brutality, with accusations of the shooting of prisoners by both sides.
One of the things that started happening in Normandy was the regular execution of Allied soldiers by German divisions. Some of this was from German units that had been brutalized on the Eastern Front and were extremely violent on the Western Front. Some of this was from units that were more deeply Nazified and patriotic, like the Hitler Jugend. But the result was, as around in the Battle of Caen, where a number of Canadian soldiers were executed, was that Allied soldiers were getting shot after they had surrendered. The response on the part of the Allied soldiers was often to execute German prisoners in revenge.
After a day of heavy fighting, the pressure from the Allies was so great that Rommel decided to abandon northern Caen and withdraw his forces across the River Orne. On the 9th of July, the northern half of Caen fell to the Allies. Not much of it was left.
Well, it's just pile of rubble. You know, the Air Force done a really good job in it, because I don't think there's a stone left standing, to be quite honest. They'd more or less wiped it out altogether.
So the combination of the two armies meeting and firing into a town in the centre, plus the fact that a 1,000 bomber raid was put on it, meant that the town was a massive ruin and rubble.
When we got through past the cobbles, we saw the cathedral was standing, and there was a hospital place beside it with Red Cross marked on it, and that had missed, the bombing had missed that. And that's where most of the French people who were in the town had gathered in this hospital. And so they escaped. There were a lot of people killed, but not as many as would have been if it hadn't been for the sheltering in the hospital, which our bombers had been avoiding.
There was no let-up for the Germans. The next day, Montgomery launched Operation Jupiter. This time, the 43rd Wessex Division would attempt to capture the strategic Hill 112.
We were asked to gain the summit, hold it and keep it, but the Germans were quite equally determined that we were not going to do so. So it was a battle of attrition, mostly between armour and armour, but the infantry were expected to advance over open fields.
Da ging ein Kampf, ich glaube, über 14 Tage mit fast täglichem Wechsel des Besitzers dieser Höhe 112. Mal waren wir da oben, mal waren die Engländer bzw. Kanadier, die dort auch im Einsatz waren, oben. Sehr verlustreich, ein kleines Wäldchen, das nachher gar nicht mehr zu erkennen war.
The fight around Hill 112 was an incredibly violent and intensive fight. The Germans had built up a substantial defense in depth, centered around machine guns, anti-tank weapons, high-velocity anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and the Allied soldiers had to fight all their way through it. They knew if they popped their head up, even from a mile away, a German tank or gun might shoot it off. And so they had to slog their way through it, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, taking enormous casualties as they went.
The inexperienced Wessex Division were up against Waffen-SS troops supported by Tiger tanks of the 102nd SS Heavy Tank Battalion.
And it became almost a mantra that if you don't know what to do next, go down, dig down, and get your head under the ground level.
The struggle for Hill 112 decimated the Wessex Division. And still they couldn't take its summit, left a no-man's land strewn with dead men and destroyed vehicles.
We took around about 4,000 casualties on that period, on that battleground, which was the villages as well as the hill.
As the fighting raged, the Allies struck a lucky blow with potentially huge consequences. Rommel's staff car was strafed by a Canadian Spitfire and driven off the road. The driver was killed, and Rommel was left unconscious for a week.
The consequences of that are severe, because Rommel had been the driving force in the defense of northwestern France, behind the establishment of defensive positions, and of course he had a very clear view of how he wanted to fight the Allies, because he'd fought them before. The moment he's wounded, the German command structure is not really thrown into disarray, but one of the big problems is that the commander, von Kluge, basically now has to double hat. And not only is he now responsible for the conduct of all the forces in northwestern France, but he also takes over Rommel's position as well. He becomes an extremely busy man, you might say. And his way of fighting differed quite severely from the way that Rommel wanted to fight.
With German high command in confusion, cautious, methodical Montgomery planned a final push on Caen, one which he declared would lead to the long-awaited breakthrough. But for Allied infantry and tank crews, the fighting would be as brutal as anything they'd faced yet. The offensive began on the 18th of July, 1944. Codenamed Operation Goodwood, the first phase would be an attack west of Caen to suck in German reserves. Then the main assault would be launched east of Caen, spearheaded by 750 tanks of the British 7th, 11th and Guards Armoured Divisions. Meanwhile, in Operation Atlantic, Canadian 2nd Corps would take the southern half of Caen. Allied bombers rained thousands of tons of high explosives onto German positions. The raid was followed by a gigantic artillery barrage. Then Allied infantry and armor began their advance.
Was für die deutschen Soldaten die wesentlichen Verwundungen brachten, waren die Materialüberlegenheit der Artillerieschläge erst einmal, bevor die Infanterie dann, die gegnerische, in diesem Fall die gegnerische Infanterie, vorgegangen ist.
At first, there was rapid progress through shattered villages and cratered fields, as German soldiers, dazed by the bombardment, gave themselves up. But then, from camouflaged positions, the feared German 88s opened up, picking off British tanks one by one.
Facing the British armour attack at Goodwood is a very strong German defence in depth. Not only have they got fortified farmhouses, they've got assault guns hidden, they've got weapons like the famous Pak-43 anti-tank gun. That's one of these ones here behind me. It's an 88mm gun, and it can fire a solid shot, armour-piercing round that would penetrate one of the British Sherman tanks out to about 2.5 kilometres away. So you have the situation that British tanks are being knocked out and they can't even see the enemy that is firing at them.
This exceptionally powerful anti-tank gun had been designed to take on Allied bombers.
They were the ones that we always feared, the 88s. They could be used, the 88s, even at anti-aircraft guns. They were an all dual-purpose gun. They could fire tanks against tanks and aircraft. They were a marvellous weapon, they were.
The Germans first used the 88mm gun as a flat gun, in other words, an anti-aircraft gun. And the idea there is they're firing rounds, such as this one here, to an enormous height to try and knock down a bomber, something up to about 20,000 feet. Now, when in the 1940 campaign, Rommel says to some flat gunners, aim your guns not in the air, but down at some approaching British tanks, and then the gun becomes a really effective anti-tank gun.
The 88, you would not hear it till it would explode, and then you'd hear the sound of it coming. That's how fast it was. That's the one I told you was unbelievable, that 88. The ones that knocked our tanks out, just like heck.
By the end of the day, the British had advanced 3 miles, while the Canadian 2nd and 3rd Divisions encircled Caen and completed its capture the following morning. At long last, Caen was in Allied hands. But Montgomery also wanted the heavily defended ridgelines south of the city as a springboard for his breakout from Normandy. For 2 days, British and Canadian tanks and infantry struggled to advance in the face of heavy machine gun and anti-tank fire. Neither envied the other's situation.
I never wanted to be in the tanks, and the guy in the tank never wanted to be the infantryman either, because he looked and saw us with no protection. It's the same with every guy's job, even the guys in the fighter planes will look at us and think, God, thank God I'm not down there. And I think, thank God I'm not up there. At least I could dig a hole in the ground. You can't do anything. You got to stay there and take it.
The British and Canadian onslaught was relentless, giving battered German divisions no time to recover or regroup. German units were at breaking point. Divisions moved to the rear for much-needed rest suddenly found themselves thrown back into the front line to fend off the latest Allied attack.
They had very little support in terms of reserves coming up. They had more or less exhausted their reserves for Normandy, and simply they were under orders to hold to the last man, and in many cases they did. This was a combination of extreme bravery and just the nature of young men put in a situation in which if you retreat, your own side will shoot you, and if you don't, the other side will shoot you. It's an appalling situation, and it was due to Hitler's order to halt in place and face the firepower that the Allies could bring to bear against them.
The 6-week Battle of Caen was won at a high price. Operation Goodwood alone cost 5,500 British and Canadian casualties and more than 300 tanks. The German army also suffered heavy losses, but incomplete records mean the true number will never be known.
The bodies would be picked up by the medical people, you know, afterwards. The smell, the stench. That was the Battle of Caen. That's what you experienced, that's what you've seen.
That's what you looked at. German bodies, Canadian bodies, British bodies. Everything was right there to look at, amongst the pigs and the horses and the cows and everything else. That's war. That's war. That's what Caen was like.
As many as 20,000 French civilians also lost their lives during the Normandy campaign, most in Allied bombing raids.
Their villages, awful, they're totally destroyed. And there's no reason really why the people who live in Normandy should be particularly grateful. And we destroyed their countryside. Caen, their big city, Villers-Bocage, we destroyed them all. The RAF smashed Caen, which really wasn't strictly necessary, and we could see it happening.
The capture of Caen did not lead to the dramatic breakout Montgomery had promised. The British and Canadians were still penned in by the heavily defended ridges south of the city, and Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe, was way behind schedule. But what the Battle of Caen had achieved was to force German commanders to commit their reserves and their most powerful panzer units to the eastern sector of the battlefield, just to hold the line. Now, 30 miles to the west, General Omar Bradley's US First Army was about to reap the reward.
By pouring in all their reinforcements toward Caen, the Germans substantially weakened their defensive lines facing the American First Army farther south. And what that meant as Bradley readied his offensive around St. Lo was there weren't that many Germans facing him on the defensive.
On the 25th of July, 1944, General Bradley and the US Army launched Operation Cobra. They would achieve the great breakout that had eluded the British and Canadians at Caen, and prove their sacrifices had not been in vain. The D-Day landings had taken Hitler by surprise. But 7 weeks on, the Germans had reinforced their defenses and successfully contained the Allied beachhead. The Allies were bogged down in heavy fighting across Normandy and needed to get inland to begin the liberation of France. It would be a fierce and bloody journey against a tenacious enemy in a challenging landscape.
You felt as though it was like a continuous death sentence, that if you went to sleep at night, you wouldn't. Next day would be the last day.
This is the story of the Normandy breakout. By 1944, after 4.5 years of war, Nazi Germany was under pressure from all sides. On the Eastern Front, Stalin's Red Army had launched a gigantic offensive in Byelorussia. In Italy, the Germans had abandoned Rome and were retreating north. While in Normandy, in northern France, following the hard-fought success of D-Day, the Allies had landed almost 1 million troops. The war might be moving in the Allies' favor, but 7 weeks on from D-Day, their forces were still bottled up in Normandy. They had to find a way to break out and get the so-called Second Front moving, or risk becoming a sideshow to the Red Army's great offensive in the east. But any advance inland was going to be difficult for the Allies.
Once the Germans had realized that D-Day was the main landing and there would not be a second landing, the Germans had moved reinforcements into that particular part of France. And on paper, the German forces look particularly strong. So they have 7 tank divisions. They have a very large concentration of Waffen-SS divisions, which by that stage, most of them can be seen as elite forces with very heavy equipment. So on paper, a very, very strong force.
By mid-July, British and Canadians were locked in a brutal slugging match around the city of Caen. And it would fall to US First Army under General Bradley to attempt the desperately needed breakout. The 51-year-old Omar Bradley was a former head of the US Army Infantry School at Fort Bragg, who'd overseen the creation of America's 1st Airborne Division, the 82nd. Having commanded a division and then an army corps during the Allied landings in North Africa and Sicily, he was given command of US First Army for the invasion of Europe. He was accustomed to working closely with Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower, his former West Point classmate.
Omar Bradley was a pretty solid general. He was tough, smart, and experienced. But he was methodical and perhaps a little bit slow. And as commander of the 1st American Army, he was also subordinate to General Bernard Montgomery, and their relationship wasn't the best. Montgomery often felt like he was getting blamed for Bradley's slowness.
Allied attacks by British Second Army around Caen had drawn the bulk of German forces off in that direction. The German line opposite US First Army was therefore relatively weakly held. Bradley planned to launch a powerful attack on a narrow front near the town of Saint-Lô, using heavy bombers and artillery to blast a hole in the German line. American infantry and tanks would then pour through the gap, capture Avranches, and secure a route out of Normandy. The British and Canadians would simultaneously launch another major attack around Caen, pinning down German divisions so they couldn't be moved to face Bradley's attack. The Allies had total control of the skies over Normandy, allowing their aircraft to bomb, strafe, and rocket German ground forces at will, with almost zero risk of interference from the once mighty Luftwaffe. Josef Schroeder was a German machine gunner who had fought on Omaha Beach.
Wir werden das nicht vergessen, wie deprimierend das für uns war. Wir konnten nichts dagegen machen. Es war nicht ein einziger deutscher Jäger am Himmel. Oder dass die Flak geschossen hätte. Nichts.
A rather grim joke told by the Germans at the time was aircraft recognition. You look up, and if the underside of the aircraft above you is painted silver, it's American. If it's painted black, it's British. And if it doesn't show up at all, it's German.
The Allies might have complete control of the skies, but on the ground, the terrain favoured the Germans, who were now entrenched in Normandy's bocage landscape. Bocage country was made up of small fields, about 100 or 200 metres square, bounded by earth banks with hedges on top. Cecil Newton was a tank gunner who came ashore on D-Day.
The terrain of the bocage, no one knew about it beforehand. No one knew about the deep lanes, the high hedges. Hadn't got a clue, and it came as a great shock.
Die Straßen sind ja von beiden Seiten mit hohen Büschen, waren die ja überdeckt, also diese Straßenrinnen, ne? Die waren überdeckt und die Straßenrinnen waren ziemlich tief. Die waren 1,20 Meter, waren manchmal noch mehr. Also die waren schon ein guter Schutz für uns. Wir haben uns dann immer da reinfallen lassen, aber wenn es dann treffen sollte, dann sind sie auch schon mal quer drüber geflogen. Oder die Hohlwege zum Beispiel, da sind ja unheimlich viele Hohlwege. Und die waren von oben ja nicht einzusehen, weil die Bäume alle oben zugewachsen waren. Da war man wie in einem Tunnel.
American troops also struggled in the giant hedgerows.
Some of them were up 4, 5, 6 feet high, and each field was completely surrounded. So in effect, what you had to do, you had to fight your way from one hedgerow to the next.
What the Germans have got is a naturally occurring trench system. They can use the hedgerows to move men down, and they can use the churches, the farmhouses and so on as strong points. And this ground has to be fought over very much like the trench systems of the First World War. And for some Americans who had served in the Pacific, it reminded them of fighting through the jungle.
But some Allied units also learned to take advantage of the terrain.
Hedgerows worked both ways. It was very difficult pushing forward in the hedgerows, but by the same token, you had about as much cover as the enemy did, and so you were protected. Well, I'd say a good bit of the time you were protected.
Invasion planners thought Allied troops would push through the hedgerows and into open country within a few days of landing. The US 29th and 35th Infantry Divisions faced some of the worst terrain around Saint-Lô, which had to be captured before General Bradley could launch his attack, codenamed Operation Cobra. On D-Day, the 29th had received a bloody baptism of fire on Omaha Beach. Now, they faced a different kind of hell. Any road or pathway could be mined or covered by concealed enemy positions.
In the bocage, you had to be careful where you walked. You had to be very cautious. You had to stay spread apart. As an infantryman, you had to use great judgment.
The Americans would have to improvise ways to break through the dense hedgerows. But it wouldn't be easy.
We had Bangalore torpedoes for barbed wire. You don't blow hedgerows with a thing. You're talking about a mini mountain that's been growing for a couple of centuries of land that the Normans have been using.
So, in US Armored Division workshops, engineers began using the thousands of leftover German beach obstacles to weld crude steel tusks to their tanks. The Americans nicknamed them rhinos.
It kind of looked like a long rake, upside down. Of course, it weighed probably a ton.
With their modified tanks leading the charge, American troops began fighting their way through the hedgerows towards Saint-Lô. But constant German ambushes inflicted a huge toll on frontline units.
We lay on June the 6th. On June the 9th, we were supposed to take Saint-Lô. It took 6 weeks to take Saint-Lô, fighting through all those hedgerows.
Und wir haben versucht, so viel als möglich, ich will mal sagen, Krach zu machen, mit unseren Möglichkeiten, mit unseren Waffen. Wenn wir dann genug geschossen hatten, dann haben wir uns an dieser Stelle 50 oder 100 Meter zur nächsten Hecke, die ja immer lebensrettend waren für uns, die Hecken, sonst hätten wir dort überhaupt nicht überstanden. Dann haben wir uns wieder 50, 100 Meter zurückversetzt und die Amerikaner haben nun alles erstmal auf diesen Punkt gerichtet, wo wir vorher uns verteidigt haben. Und wir saßen dann 200, 300 Meter zurück.
During July, in a 2-week struggle to reach Saint-Lô, US 19th Corps suffered 11,000 casualties and advanced just 5 miles.
And we went into another field that the Germans had been dropping mortar shells in. That's when I saw my Colonel Terry. He just kept on walking, and then he was hit by a sniper, and he hit the ground. His helmet flew off, and he was dead. And about 20 minutes later, a half hour, I guess, I was hit by a piece of shrapnel from a mortar shell, and I was on my way back to England, too.
On the same day, Major Howe, commanding a battalion of the US 116th Infantry Regiment, assured his commander that his men would take Saint-Lô. Major Howe was killed moments later by an artillery shell. The following day, when his men finally captured the city, they laid his body, draped in the American flag, on the rubble of its cathedral. Lessons were learned from Saint-Lô, and Bradley decided to employ overwhelming firepower to give Operation Cobra every chance of success. Crucially, his attack would have the full support of the US 9th Tactical Air Command, around 400 aircraft. Operation Cobra would be led by 7th Corps of the US First Army, with 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions making the initial assault, to be followed up by 2nd Armoured and 1st Infantry, as well as units of 8th Corps. Standing by was General George Patton and US Third Army, ready to exploit any breakthrough made by First Army. Bradley's US First Army would launch Cobra at the same time as British Second Army's latest offensive against Caen, Operation Goodwood. On the 18th of July, Goodwood went ahead as planned, but Cobra had to be delayed when heavy cloud ruled out air support. The operation began a week late, at 9:30 a.m. on the 25th of July. The first phase of the attack was to be a massive bombing raid on German positions, in a box 4 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep. 1,500 B-17 and B-24 bombers rained more than 4,000 tons of high explosive on the target area.
There were so many bombers there that it was like a conveyor belt. And as far as you could see from here directly overhead, for as far as I could see with my binoculars, just bombers.
The elite Panzer Lehr division caught the brunt of the bombing, losing around 1,000 men, a third of its total strength.
The frontline troops who were really hit hard by these bombs, to use a First World War expression, they're completely shell-shocked and they're basically not able to function anymore. So it has a huge impact on the morale of these particular people.
Das ist eine Hölle. Das ist wie eine Hölle. Da bleiben sie still liegen und warten. Ergeben, sage ich jetzt mal in Anführungszeichen, auf das Ende oder darauf, dass es sie trifft. Sie merken das ja nicht. Ich meine, wenn sie in die Luft geschleudert werden, da sind sehr viele auch einfach in diesen Trichtern wieder nach unten gespült worden, sag ich mal, geworfen worden von der Wucht der Explosion.
It was one of the most devastating ground support missions of the war. But not all bombs hit the right target.
The winds had shifted. They were supposed to only drop their bombs into the markers that put off smoke in different colors, but they couldn't see them, and they were bombing our own men.
Quite a few of the bombs fell short. Indeed, 100 Americans were killed straight away. And one of these was General Leslie McNair, the most senior American ground commander to actually be killed during World War II.
Despite the friendly fire casualties, the bombers had done their job. The Air Force had blasted a 4-mile-wide hole in the German line. Now it was up to Bradley's US First Army to smash through it and begin the breakout before the Germans could recover. US infantry began their advance. They faced units commanded by a highly experienced German Field Marshal, Günther von Kluge. Von Kluge was a Prussian officer of the old school and a favorite of Hitler's for his performance during the invasions of France and the Soviet Union. In early July, he was appointed commander-in-chief in the West after Hitler sacked von Rundstedt, and he became commander of Army Group B as well when Field Marshal Rommel was injured in an Allied air attack. Hitler was counting on von Kluge for a miracle, but the veteran commander had bad news for the Führer.
He writes to Hitler almost immediately, saying exactly what Von Rundstedt and Rommel had told Hitler a month before that they're reaching the point at which they just can't hold the line. They're being worn out. They're running out of ammunition, they're running out of men.
Von Kluge was relying on 7th Army to deal with any American attack. But some of its units had been in almost constant combat since D-Day and were under strength and exhausted. All units were short of fuel and ammunition. Panzer Lehr Division, which had arrived in Normandy 6 weeks ago with more than 200 tanks, now had 31 left. But Panzer Lehr and the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, were elite units and dangerous opponents in any circumstances. To add to von Kluge's problems, the devastating US air raid, followed by an intense artillery bombardment, made it almost impossible for him to communicate with forward units, or to find out what was happening at the front. By comparison, US forces brought cutting-edge technology to the battlefield that made their command and control significantly more effective.
This piece of American technology revolutionized battlefield communications. Unlike other armies which were still using radio sets with big long aerials which pointed directly to the radio operators and gave positions away, American commanders could now carry their own radios and be in direct contact with other units. The Germans, on the other hand, were still using First War technology. They'd failed to come up with a decent wireless technology before the Second World War. They were pretty much using field telephone sets with cables run out to all their command posts and headquarters. And of course, when the American aerial barrage started and the artillery started blasting their positions, those telephone cables were very quickly cut, and very soon they were out of contact with each other and weren't able to command their troops in the field.
And what's more, Allied forces were able to use radio communications to coordinate between ground and air forces.
This all started at St. Lo, when the Air Force bombed us at St. Lo twice. They had no control with the aircraft. They finally come up with air-ground control. And they formed the 9th Air Force, and the P-47s were designated to support the infantry. The Thunderbolt, I think it had 8 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, 8 of them. Big sucker, I mean a real heavy-duty thing. And that was assigned mainly to the infantry. And when we called in strafing missions out in front, they go right over us and then open up when they get beyond. Or they'd come in parallel with the front line.
But the new system did have its teething problems.
The American tanks had their own radios, but they were on a different frequency than the fighter bombers flying overhead. Because of that, the Americans had to put Air Force radio men in the tanks with special radios that could actually talk to the P-47 and P-51 pilots.
On the first day of Operation Cobra, US 7th Corps' progress was disappointing, just a mile and a half. But the next morning, General Bradley committed Sherman tanks of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions to the attack. Reports began to come in that past the front line, American troops were encountering only sporadic resistance. On the morning of the 3rd day, Commander of the 30th Infantry Division, General Hobbs, reported, "This thing has busted wide open." That same day, American troops had reached Coutances, Cerisy-la-Salle, and Villebaudon, and threatened to cut off half of German 7th Army in a pocket around Rancé. The trapped German units, including remnants of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, tried to fight their way out under cover of darkness. They ran straight into US 2nd Armored, and after a night of furious, chaotic fighting, their columns were left decimated. Few managed to break through. In the face of the overwhelming US onslaught on the ground and from the air, German 7th Army began to collapse.
Erst als nach diesen Bombardements der Durchbruch gelang und die Alliierten dann bis auf Orange vorstießen, haben wir geahnt, dass das also hier oben, dass wir hier nicht mehr lange bleiben würden. Ich habe an diesem Vorstoß gegen Avranches teilgenommen, der wurde abgebrochen.
Germans began to surrender in droves, 7,000 in a single day. German prisoners blocking the roads were now causing more delay to the American advance than enemy resistance. On the 30th of July, US 4th Armored Division took Avranches, and the next day captured the strategically crucial bridge at Pont-Aux-Bois, intact. The bridge was the gateway to Brittany and beyond. Now was the time to unleash General Patton and US Third Army.
From early in his career, Patton had the idea that movement and fire were the main duties of a soldier. And if you weren't moving and you weren't firing, you weren't much of a soldier. Now he was going to have the opportunity to lead his Third Army across the river into Brittany, the big right hook which would help to unhinge the German defence and outflank the enemy.
In just 3 days, 7 US divisions crossed the bridge at Pont-Aux-Bois, heading west into Brittany, south towards the Loire River, and southeast towards Le Mans. In Brittany, German forces didn't hang around to face the Americans in open country, but withdrew to the heavily fortified Atlantic ports. Their heavy coastal guns, so well protected they were virtually immune to artillery and air attack, kept US forces at bay for weeks. While US infantry encircled the ports, Patton's armoured divisions were free to resume their advance across the French countryside at astonishing speed. Key to the Americans' rapid advance was the use of mechanized forces.
This is one of the American half-tracks that were made in the Second World War. Just before the war began, the Americans had been experimenting, knowing that they were going to mechanize their army if a war came. And just before the war begins, they take the M2 front of a scout car and add it to a longer body with tracks on. Many different companies end up making variants of this half-track. And they get to the point that by the end of the war, the Americans have made 55,000 half-tracks like this. Propaganda from the Nazis make us believe that the Germans are the ones that have a fully mechanized force, when in actual fact, about 80% of their transport is actually managed by horses, not armoured vehicles or trucks. They have 11 million horses in service, and that's how they actually get an awful lot of their supplies and men around the battlefield. And that contrast just shows the ability of the Americans to turn on a tap with their car and automotive industry to produce so many of these amazingly reliable, simple and effective vehicles.
Operation Cobra had been a complete success. Finally, after nearly 2 months pinned down in the Normandy bocage, the Allies were on the move. Hitler was furious when he received news of the American breakout. 10 days before, on the 20th of July, he'd narrowly survived an assassination attempt when a bomb exploded at his headquarters in East Prussia. 4 soldiers had been killed, but the Führer escaped serious injury. Here he can be seen visiting some of the men seriously wounded by the blast. His would-be assassins turned out to be army officers.
By the Battle of Normandy, most German generals, including Rommel, knew that the war was lost, and they were looking desperately for some way to preserve Germany and their own militaristic life with the German army.
Hitler's fraught relationship with his generals sank to an all-time low.
A substantial number of them had been involved in the bomb plot, and so Hitler not only distrusted them, but began purging large swaths of the German high command.
Even Field Marshal Rommel, Hitler's favorite general, was implicated in the plot.
He receives a visit by 2 German generals who take him in a car and put it to him that now might be a good idea to commit suicide, because if he didn't do that, he'd be taken to Berlin, would be interrogated, and we all know what that means. So he decides to commit suicide in the car as he's driving along with these 2 generals.
One of the effects of the purge that Hitler carried out after the July bomb plot was that it substantially reduced the number of experienced and effective generals he had to use on the Western Front. And so not only was Hitler micromanaging the military operations, he was also finding it hard to find someone who could command them effectively.
For weeks, German commanders in France, first von Rundstedt and Rommel, now von Kluge, had pleaded with Hitler for permission to withdraw from Normandy to a new defensive line along the Seine River. Now it was the only realistic option left, but to Field Marshal von Kluge's horror, Hitler instead ordered a counterattack. Hitler told von Kluge to gather the last few panzer divisions in Normandy and attack from Mortain towards the coast at Avranches to cut off Patton's Third Army to the south. The counterattack was codenamed Lüttich. But the Allies knew it was coming, thanks to their ability to decode German military communications sent using their famous Enigma machine, a top-secret intelligence source known as Ultra. But this time, warning of the German counterattack, led by 150 tanks and elite units of the Waffen-SS, didn't reach American frontline units until the last minute. In desperate fighting around Mortain, a battalion of the US 30th Infantry Division, dug into Hill 314, was surrounded. Despite heavy losses, they held their ground, using their vantage point to call in artillery and airstrikes on the German armor. American and British fighter bombers made pass after pass. Within 24 hours, the German offensive had been stopped in its tracks. Worse, Hitler's intervention had left his forces vulnerable to an Allied counterstrike. The best German divisions were now concentrated at the western tip of an exposed salient. Montgomery saw the potential for a huge envelopment of German forces in Normandy. Patton, advancing rapidly towards Chartres and Orléans, was ordered to divert one corps north to Argenton, while the newly formed Canadian First Army would push south towards high ground overlooking the town of Falaise. The advance, codenamed Operation Totalize, was to be led by Major General Guy Simonds' Canadian Second Corps, made up of Canadian, British and Polish forces. Their first obstacle was the formidable Verrières Ridge, where two previous attempts to break through had already failed, at a cost of nearly 3,000 casualties. Simonds planned an aerial bombardment to prepare the way for a mechanized assault. But with a shortage of armored personnel carriers, the dilemma was how to protect the infantry.
One of the problems the Allies faced early in the Normandy campaign was when the tanks advanced, they sometimes lost contact with the infantry. So the Canadian commander came up with a brilliant suggestion. Let's take some redundant self-propelled artillery, basically artillery pieces on a tank chassis, take the guns out, plate over the front, and we'll make a heavily armoured personnel carrier. And they used that for the first time as part of Operation Totalize, having a section of infantry in a tracked armoured vehicle that can keep up with the tanks going forward. And that leads to the innovation of taking redundant tanks, such as this ram tank, the turret is taken off, and a section of 8 infantry could be carried in here with 2 crew members in the front as well. And that means they've got a level of protection as they go forward into battle that other soldiers just don't have.
Ian Hamilton from Kent was a tank commander and fought from D-Day to the end of the war.
Operation Totalize was pushed out to take place at night. There would be an RAF night bomber Lancaster bombing raid on the German lines first. That would be followed by all the Allied ground artillery following up with a huge barrage, and then we went in at night at around about 11 o'clock. It was pitch black. It was a pitch black night.
As the bombardment was lifted, the mechanized columns moved forward, feeling their way to their objectives through the darkness.
The attack was going to be all on tracks, I mean tanks, and the infantry would come later. It was arranged for 4 lines of tanks, led by flails in case we came across minefields. And to help us on our way, a Bofors anti-aircraft gun would fire bursts of 5 rounds of tracer. So it gave him his direction.
Thanks to careful planning, the Canadian night attack was a success, and Verrières Ridge was in Allied hands by noon. Tanks were then sent forward to exploit the breakthrough. In the lead, the Canadian 4th Armoured and Polish 1st Armoured Divisions. As the battle became more confused, friendly fire once more became a serious hazard, as Allied aircraft hit friend and foe alike.
So I looked up, here they're coming, a whole gang of them. I said, boy, so I just took my helmet off, and I give them hell, boys. And then I clapped the helmet back on fast because the bomb door's open, and here's the bomb's whistle coming down. I looked over, there was a little German slit trench that the German had dug, and I dove in there like a rabbit.
The largest number of casualties from this friendly fire was from the 1st Polish Armoured Division.
The coalition of forces under Eisenhower for the campaign in Northwest Europe didn't just consist of the British, the Americans, and the Canadians. There were other nationalities involved with their own ways of fighting and their own political ambitions. 2nd French Armoured Division played the leading part in liberating Paris for political reasons. There were also forces from Belgium, from the Netherlands, and from Norway. And perhaps the most extraordinary fighting division on the Allied side was 1st Polish Armoured Division, made up of Poles who had either escaped from the country in 1939 or later, or who had come from around the world to fight for Poland. They had been equipped by the British, and they fought as part of 1st Canadian Army.
The Germans were terrified of Polish troops out to settle scores.
He was a young Hitler Youth chap, and we caught him through the knee. We got as much out of him as we could, but he wasn't in a fit state, really. So I thought he needs some medical attention, and the Polish Armoured Division were just about to move through us for the next phase of the attack. So I walked to a half-track with a Red Cross on, spoke to the doctor and said, I've got a man here who needs attention. And he sent 2 of his men with a stretcher, and he plonked it down beside this boy, because he was 15. And they bent down to pick him up, to put him on it, and he saw their flash, Poland. He did not want to go with them. 9, he said. But they picked him up anyway and donked him on the stretcher and carried him off. I've often wondered what happened to him.
It was 12th SS Panzer, the infamous Hitler Youth Division, that now led the German counterattack against Operation Totalize. They were supported by 7 Tiger tanks, led by famous SS tank ace, Michael Wittman. The Allies had once regarded these heavy German tanks as almost unstoppable, but now they had a weapon that was able to take them on.
One of the problems the British had was how to fit their new 17-pounder anti-tank gun into a tank. So as an improvisation, they got the 17-pounder, squeezed it into the Sherman. Now the 17-pounder gun, when it was firing, discarding sabot ammunition, that meant it had greater penetration on it than the Tiger's 88mm gun. With the British attack in Operation Totalize, they'd advanced overnight and they spread themselves out either side of the main Caen to Falaise road. Now the Germans, naturally, it's in their doctrine, they react to that attack very quickly and put in a counterattack. Wittman, in his Tiger tanks, drives up the middle of the road between two sets of woods on either side. As Wittman's Tigers head up the main Caen to Falaise road, he's taken on by the tanks of the Northants Yeomanry. A young gunner, Joe Eakins, is in one of these Fireflies, and he drives the tank out of the wood, takes on the rear German Tiger. He then works his way along the line of German vehicles, and at the same time, from the other side of the valley, fire is coming in from the Canadian tanks. Now, there seems a slight irony about this communal effort of the British and the Canadian forces taking out what is the German propaganda icon, Michael Wittman, this famous SS tank ace.
The following day, the 9th of August, Canadian troops pushed on towards Falaise. The Germans were now in a desperate situation, but fought ferociously for Caen Woods and Hill 195.
Well, we lost a bunch of guys as it was. We had about 20 killed. Our sergeant, he was at my side, or not too far away from me one minute, and the next minute he was gone. I didn't know what had happened to him.
Adair's unit was forced to pull back. In fact, despite its early successes, Total Eyes had ground to a halt all along the line. Allied commanders hoped to seal off German forces in a pocket by taking Falaise. So far, they'd not been able to close the trap. But Simmons wasn't done yet. By the 14th of August, British, Canadian, and Polish troops were ready for a new push. An attack that Allied commanders hoped would seal the fate of German forces in Normandy. Hitler, meanwhile, seemed interested only in ordering more futile counterattacks. It wasn't until the last moment that he finally accepted the danger of encirclement and authorized a retreat. Nevertheless, he sacked the man who'd been urging this course of action for weeks, his commander in the west, Field Marshal von Kluge.
Convinced that Kluge had failed him, and also that the reason for Kluge's absence from his headquarters might have been that he was negotiating with the Allies, Hitler summoned him back to Berlin. Kluge knew he was doomed. He wrote a long, rambling letter explaining why this was not his fault and blaming everybody else he could think of, and he committed suicide.
On the 19th of August, the Polish 1st Armored Division made contact with the US 90th Infantry Division at Chambois, and the trap closed around 15 German divisions. For 2 days, elite German SS units and paratroopers fought to force open an escape corridor, all the while under relentless Allied bombardment.
It's terrible. You can't, there's no way of describing it, especially in Falaise there, that noise and that, all those gunfire, that steady roar all the time, and you're trying to, well, you couldn't hear commands. You just followed and hoped you were going in the right direction.
RAF Typhoons flew sortie after sortie, wreaking havoc on the cornered German forces. First tested in 1940, this powerful single-seater fighter-bomber was a challenge for even skilled pilots.
Just to give an example, a Hurricane motor was about 1,300 horsepower. This motor in the Typhoon was 2,400 horsepower. So it was a monster of a big fighter. And a Hurricane weighed about 2.5 tons. The Typhoon weighed 7 tons. It was a big aircraft.
The Typhoon packed a devastating punch of 4 20mm cannon and 8 unguided rockets, each with a 60-pound warhead.
We'd dive in at probably 50, 60 degrees, or get down around 2,000 feet or 3,000 feet. Fire your rockets, fire your cannon, and when you got too close to the ground, you started to pull out.
21st of August, the Allies closed off the last escape route. And from all sides, the encircled German 7th Army was subjected to an unrelenting barrage of artillery fire and air attack. For German soldiers, the Falaise Pocket became hell on earth. Thousands were killed. The survivors, 50,000 of them, surrendered. Soldiers on both sides were sickened by the slaughter.
I want to go home. Home, he kept saying home, home. I knew what he was thinking, same thing I was thinking. Let's get this damn thing over and get back home, see?
We would give them cigarettes and water or wherever they wanted. We didn't have any animosity towards them. We did a little bit of looting, taking their watches and money or whatever they had. We thought that was all right. We didn't see anything wrong with that. But we respected those guys because they did what they had to do. When it was over, they were just as glad it was over, and we were glad that they were quitting too.
Those who surrendered left behind the bodies of 10,000 comrades, as well as hundreds of abandoned vehicles and guns, and thousands of horses used as transport by an army that had run out of fuel.
Awful chaos for all the Germans. I mean, they had numbers of equipment and dead people all over the place, vehicles wrecked.
If we felt any pity for the Germans, we felt it then, because they were it was like a slaughterhouse.
When you got to the Falaise Gap, you started to feel very sorry for them, because they'd been trapped by silly orders from Hitler, and you began to feel, I mean, the most terrible thing. But I mean, there were some very fanatical soldiers, and you knew they would show no mercy.
When Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower visited the battlefield, he described it as unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. It was possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. There was more bad news for Hitler. At the height of the Battle of Falaise, the Allies landed 150,000 troops in southern France in a huge amphibious operation codenamed Dragoon.
The strategic result of the breakout toward Falaise and then Paris, and the landing of American forces in southern France in Operation Dragoon, was to completely destroy any German hopes of holding on to France. As a result, what was really going on was a rout. German forces were simply trying to get eastward as fast as possible to a place where they could set up any kind of defensive line.
As the Falaise Pocket collapsed, Patton's units were already establishing bridgeheads across what German commanders hoped would be their next defensive line, the Seine River. Patton's main problem was no longer German resistance, it was keeping his forward units supplied with fuel. Across France, Allied troops were now advancing faster than the Germans had with their blitzkrieg invasion of 1940, liberating more villages and towns every day.
The French population were beside themselves with love, kindness, kisses, wine, booze, oranges. They had a nasty habit, didn't mean us, of throwing fruit at us. And there were a lot of tank crews with black eyes from apples and the all meant very well. And screaming, loving it, singing the Marseillaise, singing Hallelujah, God Save the King, anything that they could think of. We'd never come across it before.
But the terrible destruction and suffering caused by Allied bombing left some locals with mixed feelings towards their liberators.
People were so jubilant when you got there, except the French were a little bit, but we could understand that. They'd suffered heavily in the bombardment of Normandy, so I don't think they particularly liked us all that much at that stage. But then later on, they got very friendly.
The French capital posed a particular challenge for Allied commanders. While not a strategic target, Paris was a political prize, and its liberation had symbolic value.
Eisenhower decided to liberate Paris, but he made the critical mistake of not allowing the one French armored division under General Leclerc to lead the charge into the city. Leclerc decided to disobey orders, stole a march on the rest of his allies, and entered Paris as the leading unit of the Allied Liberation Force.
As shooting broke out on the streets between French resistance and the German garrison, the German governor of Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, had a decision to make.
Hitler had ordered him to hold Paris to the last man, and if necessary, burn the whole city down. But Choltitz didn't want to do that, and he defied Hitler and made the decision to surrender Paris rather than defending it to the death.
There was, to a degree, an admiration for French culture, French society, the French language. So he didn't really want to carry out this order. There's also another reason, of course, why he decided not to do that, is because just like anyone who was of open and clear mind, he did realize that Germany would no longer be able to win the war. And there was just a completely scorched earth policy for no absolutely military or any other reason whatsoever. And of course, he also did realize that if he did carry out that order and was then later captured by the Allies, that would not look particularly good and reflect particularly well on his performance. So he was trying to cover his own back to a degree as well.
On the 25th of August, after 4 years of Nazi occupation, Paris was liberated.
There were still many German snipers behind, but our movement was onto the Champs-Élysées, just beyond the Arc de Triomphe, and we would come on German snipers in apartment buildings and had to fire at them. But also, the French weren't worried about that. They were trying to greet us and greet their countrymen who had come with General Leclerc's army. And it was a joyous occasion. The French ladies were generous with their flowers and their kisses, and we fought it off the best we could.
2 months of attritional warfare in Normandy were behind the Allies. The long-awaited breakout, which began with Operation Cobra, had triggered a collapse in the German army in France. And within days, Eisenhower would be looking at plans to push on to Germany itself. But many more hard battles lay ahead. The German army remained a formidable enemy, experienced, well-led, and now fighting to defend its homeland from invasion. September 1944. The Western Allies were closing in on the German heartland. But now, the formidable defences of the Siegfried Line stood in their path. So the Allies came up with a daring plan to bypass the German defences and cross the River Rhine in a single bound, with the largest deployment of airborne infantry ever seen.
We all knew that Market Garden was a very big deal from the moment we saw the airborne going overhead.
But the elite Allied soldiers sent into battle soon discovered the plan was badly flawed.
It was a disaster from beginning to end.
And that it was never wise to underestimate the German army.
You was in for a fight. No two ways about it.
There were an awful lot of Germans in the Netherlands, and we found them.
This is the story of Operation Market Garden. The D-Day landings of June 1944 had been followed by weeks of grueling fighting in Normandy. But finally, the Western Allies had forced the German army into headlong retreat. German losses were enormous. 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, as well as thousands of vehicles and heavy weapons destroyed. That September, the German army was still desperately trying to rebuild its forces in the West and preparing for a final battle to defend Germany itself. But just at the moment the Germans seemed beaten, the Allies were running into their own difficulties.
In September 1944, the Allies were suffering a severe supply shortage because their supplies still had to be brought to the front line from the Normandy beaches. The Germans knew about this, and they knew that the Allied advance had slowed down mainly because of a lack of supplies.
What the Allies needed to solve their supply crisis was a Channel port, but they were either still in German hands or, like Cherbourg, had been comprehensively sabotaged by the Germans before their liberation. The Allied supply lines were now 300 miles long and could no longer deliver enough fuel and ammunition to frontline units to sustain the pace of the advance. But British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a bold plan, one which he believed would allow the Allies to sidestep the supply crisis and end the war by Christmas 1944. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, or Monty, had commanded all Allied land forces during the D-Day landings and the Normandy campaign. But now US troops outnumbered British and Canadian. It was no longer politically acceptable for a British general to command them. So Churchill had promoted Monty to Field Marshal, while he was effectively demoted to command the mostly British and Canadian 21st Army Group. Allied intelligence reports indicated that the Germans' northern flank, opposite 21st Army Group, was lightly defended. So Monty proposed that his force attack north from Belgium into the Netherlands, bypassing Germany's strongest defences along the Siegfried Line, to encircle Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr Valley and pave the way for a direct advance on Berlin. He named his plan Operation Market Garden. But Monty would have to sell the plan to the Supreme Allied Commander, American General Dwight Eisenhower, who had his own plan for the advance.
Eisenhower was content, for political reasons and for alliance reasons, to keep the advance more or less even across the front. This is the so-called broad front advance, that everybody would share the risks and share the achievements. This is very much Eisenhower's style, but there simply weren't enough resources for this. What Montgomery wanted was to divert the resources to a northern arm, the so-called narrow front attack. And he believed that if this was done, then he could get through to the Ruhr early enough to end the war in a matter of months.
But if Monty was going to get extra supplies for Operation Market Garden, someone else would have to lose out.
The personal politics of Market Garden are also quite fascinating. Montgomery lobbied Eisenhower ruthlessly and without end to carry out this operation. Montgomery knew that any resources given to him would be taken away from the Americans like Patton farther south, and he lobbied Eisenhower until Eisenhower finally gave in and gave Montgomery his pet airborne operation.
Montgomery got his supplies, as well as use of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, an elite force of 40,000 British, American and Polish soldiers, ready to be dropped behind enemy lines by parachute and glider. Montgomery made these troops the cornerstone of a bold, ambitious plan that required clockwork precision. British 30th Corps was to advance 64 miles along a single road from the Belgian border to the Dutch town of Arnhem, but their route crossed several rivers and canals, including 2 major branches of the Lower Rhine. So 3 Allied airborne divisions would drop ahead of the ground forces to seize key bridges along the route, including 2 major bridges over the Lower Rhine at Nijmegen and Arnhem, before the Germans could destroy them or organize their defense. The bridges were well defended by anti-aircraft guns to ward off Allied bombers, so the airborne troops were to land several miles from their targets and complete their approach on foot. The airborne assault was codenamed Market, the ground attack, Garden. The spearhead of Lieutenant General Horrock's 30th Corps was the Guards Armoured Division, with 268 tanks, mostly Shermans. They'd be supported by the 43rd Wessex and 50th Northumbrian Infantry Divisions, tanks of the 8th Armoured Brigade and Royal Engineer bridging units. Airborne troops were under the command of Lieutenant General Browning's British 1st Airborne Corps, made up of British 1st Airborne Division, a Polish parachute brigade, and 2 US divisions attached for the operation, the 82nd and 101st Airborne. The Royal Air Force and US Army Air Force would provide 1,500 transport aircraft and 500 gliders to get troops to their targets. Lieutenant General Boy Browning, commanding the Allied airborne troops, was Britain's senior airborne officer, married to the famous novelist Daphne du Maurier. Seen by some as difficult to work with, relations with his American boss, 1st Allied Airborne Army Commander Lieutenant General Brereton, were particularly strained. In the run-up to the operation, reports arrived that German SS Panzer units had been seen near Arnhem, the British airborne objective. A British intelligence officer took the reports to Browning.
The Corps intelligence officer, a chap called Van Urquhart, he warned us that there were 2 SS Panzer divisions lined up from Arnhem to Zutphen, and that he had warned General Browning about this. And he said Browning's plan for the operation would fail unless he altered them to take account of these 2 divisions. And Browning had told him that he was not to tell any of us about it, and that he did not believe that the tanks really were operable because they'd just been fighting in Normandy.
If there were German panzer units near Arnhem, the entire operation would probably be called off. And Browning and many others in the elite airborne corps were determined to press ahead. The Netherlands had fallen to German blitzkrieg in May 1940, but since then the country had remained relatively unscathed by global war.
Das war wie Friedenszeiten. In Holland schien die Welt für uns noch in Ordnung. Das lag einmal daran, dass die Wetterbedingungen hervorragend waren. Wir hatten sehr schöne Straßenverhältnisse mit Baumbewuchs, mit Alleen, sodass man sich auch am Tage bewegen konnte. Man war gegen Luftangriffe zumindest geschützt oder schien geschützt zu sein. Man konnte nicht so leicht entdeckt werden.
But on the night of the 16th of September, British and American bombers struck German airfields and anti-aircraft positions across the Netherlands. At 9:45 a.m. the next day, thousands of aircraft of the 1st Airborne Army took off from their bases in England and set course for their drop zones. The vast air armada formed up in 2 columns, 3 miles across and a staggering 94 miles long.
There were still planes still taking off in England while men were dropping in Holland. That's how vast it was. You could actually step over from one plane to another all the way across the channel to Holland from England.
Johnny Peters was in one of the leading British gliders, with clear views ahead.
Right, when we went over the North Sea, we could see the air-sea rescue boats in there, our channel men, so it was very reassuring to see these air-sea rescue boats in case we ditched in the sea. It was a beautiful flight. Blazing sun, a huge convoy, about 3 miles wide, all full of planes. Extraordinary sight, wonderful sight.
One of the largest gliders taking part in Market Garden was the Airspeed Horsa. A British design built mostly of spruce and plywood, its prefabricated sections were often put together by furniture makers. The Horsa carried 2 pilots and 25 troops, or loads such as a jeep or a small anti-tank gun. Allied gliders were towed towards the landing zone by transport aircraft or bombers, then released to glide silently down towards their target. although they weren't guaranteed a smooth landing, gliders did an excellent job of dropping a unit onto its target without scattering them, as often happened in parachute drops. As the first wave of Operation Market reached the Netherlands, they discovered that plenty of German anti-aircraft guns had survived the previous night's raid by Allied bombers.
The ack gunners fired in the front of us. Shortly afterwards, a cry went up from the back of the glider, the tail's coming off. Now, this was relayed from the back to the front. I was sitting in the front behind the pilots, and my sergeant was sitting opposite, and he relayed that back to the pilot. He sent Ralph Maltby to have a look. He came back, big grin on his face, say, "You're all right. The fabric's being hit. It's only flapping about, but the tail's not coming off." So he sat down. We were very reassured about that.
It was a narrow escape for everyone on board. But as Johnny Peters' glider approached the landing zone, they came under more fire, and the co-pilot was hit.
I knew he died by the look on Sergeant Watson's face. Then you think to yourself, well, what would happen if the pilot get killed? None of us could pilot the glider. The German machine gunners were firing their bullets, and they were coming through the glider, and only one bullet hit a bloke named Private Hughes in the leg, but he made a good landing.
In most landing zones, German air defences were light and caught off guard. Most gliders touched down safely in open farmland. The parachute drops went almost exactly according to plan. Of the 1,000 transport aircraft used on the first day, just 27 were destroyed.
We weren't under fire at all coming in. It was really nice. It was on a Sunday afternoon, about 1 o'clock. Sun was shining, and it was an ideal type of operation, I call it.
The British 1st Airborne Division landed 6 to 8 miles northwest of Arnhem with near total surprise.
It was a perfect summer's day. We landed with no opposition at all.
The US 82nd Airborne, landing near Nijmegen, were immediately welcomed by Dutch locals.
While we were picking up our equipment, all the Dutch civilians were coming out of the tree line, and they're all speaking perfect English. And I said to my buddy, "Are we still in England or is this Holland?" They spoke perfect English. They wanted to tell us where the Germans were, and we wanted to get them off the landing zone so they wouldn't get hit.
Meanwhile, the US 101st Airborne landed further south, near Eindhoven. Second Lieutenant Frank Gregg received a less friendly reception.
I landed and right on the drop zone, and it was filled with big Holstein cows, milk cows. And they panicked, of course, when all these parachutes started coming down. And I'm thinking, oh man, I'd hate to have to write home from the hospital that I was severely wounded by a big Holstein cow or something like that, or even killed by one, because they were really running around in the pasture.
The US airborne troops quickly took control of the road between Eindhoven and Nijmegen. The Netherlands had been under Nazi occupation for 4 years, but the arrival of the Allied forces came as a huge delight for its citizens, especially for members of one of the best organized resistance groups in Europe.
I got all my troops to the bridge, and about the time I got my foot on one end of the bridge, a Dutchman and a very pretty girl stepped on the other end. They were in black leather coats like the Germans wore, and both carrying submachine guns slung over their shoulders. And I said, I'm not sure these people are friendly. So anyway, the girl came bursting over toward me and said, "We are from the Dutch underground, and we are here to help you in any way you need help." I thanked her and so forth. She gave me a briefing on that there were no enemy in town. It was clear of Germans.
The airborne part of the operation had started well. Most troops had landed on or close to their intended drop zone. Now they needed to secure the vital bridges along 30th Corps' route to the Rhine. But the Allies didn't have it all their own way. A dash to the Arnhem Bridge by British paratroopers in jeeps hit a German roadblock. Most were killed or captured. The Paras would have to reach the bridge on foot, but it would be a hard slog.
One of the first mistakes that Browning made, he dropped us 7 miles from the bridge, and we were all carrying about 80 pounds worth of equipment and weapons. You can't run all the way. Merely walking take about 4 hours.
Problems were developing elsewhere too. North of Eindhoven, German engineers and Luftwaffe trainees blew up bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal before US paratroopers could reach them. 30 miles northeast at Nijmegen, more bridges across the Maas-Waal Canal were blown before the 82nd Airborne got to them. Back in Arnhem, British 1st Airborne was about to run into the SS Panzer units that Major Urquhart had tried to warn of. Fortunately, they were well below full strength.
One of the legends, shall we say, about Operation Market Garden was that 1st British Airborne Division, which dropped at Arnhem, was dropping on top of 2 SS armoured divisions, 2 SS Panzer divisions. That is true in the sense that 9th and 10th SS Panzer Division were in the area, but they had been so badly destroyed in the Battle of Normandy and the subsequent retreat. They were really only as strong as what the Germans called Kampfgruppe, that is to say, something about the size of a weak division with not too many tanks. But even in those terms, the Allies were taking a risk which really only made sense if the Germans weren't going to fight. And they did.
Another surprise for British 1st Airborne was that they'd landed almost on top of German Army Group B headquarters, from where Field Marshal Model would orchestrate a rapid German response. Model was Germany's youngest field marshal and greatly admired by Hitler and other senior commanders for his performance on the Eastern Front. He had been nicknamed the Führer's fireman for his ability to salvage apparently disastrous situations, even when his forces were heavily outnumbered.
The fact that he is a completely driven, also committed soldier are summed up by many accounts that we see, that he was very tough and very hard against his own troops, because he really wanted to achieve things, but also very hard and tough against himself, and for that the people admired and respected him.
As German commanders planned their response to the landings, they were handed a gift. In the wreckage of a crashed Allied glider, German troops found a complete set of orders for Operation Market Garden. Model saw that if he could hold the Allies at Nijmegen, the British paratroopers at Arnhem would remain cut off, and the Allied operation would fail. He split 2nd SS Panzer Corps into Kampfgruppe, or battle groups. Kampfgruppe Hohenstaufen was to hold Arnhem and its bridge against the British, while Kampfgruppe Frundsberg raced south over Arnhem Bridge to prevent the Allies crossing at Nijmegen.
The concept of Battlegroup or Kampfgruppe in German is a very specific concept that you could find in the German army in the Second World War. The idea was that whenever the need arose, you would form ad hoc formations out of existing formations, quite often of broken up formations or formations that already received or taken a lot of casualties, and form a new fighting body out of these.
Improvised Kampfgruppen helped Germany make the most of its dwindling military strength and respond rapidly to new threats.
Ihr geht da runter, ihr müsst euch beeilen, kämpft alles nieder, was ihr euch im Weg stellt, und ihr müsst dann alle zusammen mit den anderen, die dort ankommen, einen Kessel bilden.
The swift German response meant Allied airborne troops were soon engaged in heavy fighting. At 2:35 p.m., the Allied ground attack began. Tanks of British 30th Corps crossed the Dutch-Belgian border on the road to Arnhem. Working to a strict timetable, they needed to reach Eindhoven by the end of the day, but the single road through open country was highly exposed. Within 10 minutes, they were hit by a German ambush and lost several tanks.
We were being fired on from the flanks as we pushed up the road. I don't know if you know Holland, but it was then just a series of country roads. There was nowhere to go. The tank wouldn't go off the road, he'd sink, because Holland was built on water.
You travelled on dike roads most of the time, and travelling on dike roads in the dark and the wet is not very comfortable at times.
With air support from Typhoon fighter bombers, the British tanks pushed on, along what soon became known as Hell's Highway. 30th Corps only managed to advance 5 miles on the first day, failing to reach Eindhoven, which remained in German hands. Just 24 hours into the operation, and Market Garden was already behind schedule. Allied airborne units were now in heavy fighting for a series of bridges that 30th Corps would need for their advance through the Netherlands into Germany itself. The 101st Airborne Division had successfully captured the crossings at Eindhoven. The 82nd, tasked with capturing the bridges at Nijmegen, were just south of their objective, at Grave. But at Arnhem, British 1st Airborne was in trouble. About 5,000 men were scattered west of town, in heavy fighting with local German forces, as well as the Waffen-SS troops. Only around 300 men had managed to reach their objective, the Arnhem Road Bridge, and were now dug in at its northern end, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost. John Frost was an experienced officer and one of the first to join the newly formed Parachute Regiment in 1941. He'd led daring missions into German-held territory before, including the successful Bruneval raid on the coast of occupied France to steal top-secret German radar equipment. Now he was in command of the tiny force of British paratroopers who had got through to the objective. As night fell, John Frost radioed divisional headquarters that they had secured the northern end of the bridge. He was ordered to hold his position until 30th Corps reached him. Around 9 p.m, Frost was reinforced by a group led by Major Tony Hibbert.
We had been ordered in the brigade orders that our job was to capture Arnhem Bridge and hold it for 48 hours until we were relieved from the south. Well, we'd actually done the job. We'd captured the bridge. We held the north end of it, which was the only bit that was necessary.
On day 2 of the operation, Frost's small force remained dug in around the north end of Arnhem Bridge, cut off from the rest of their division.
There were about nearly 600 chaps at John Frost's disposal, and he disposed them into a tight perimeter, but he could only go so far as he had chaps.
Then the paratroopers heard the sound of vehicles approaching from the south. It must be 30th Corps come to relieve them.
We thought that the tanks were in fact our own tanks coming from the south, the ones that were actually going to relieve us. And it was quite extraordinary. We had, as I say, about 160 people on the bridge, and they all took off their helmets and put their berets on and came out to cheer them forward. And of course, it wasn't until they came up to the top of the bridge that we saw that they'd got the wrong insignia on.
The vehicles belonged to an SS reconnaissance unit. When they realized the bridge was in British hands, they tried to rush it. But the paratroopers were ready.
And you could see the fear on their face, what they were running into. We had 3 para under there, and they opened up and they killed all those people that charged over the bridge.
The German column was wiped out in a barrage of fire from small arms, anti-tank guns, and the British Army's unique anti-tank weapon, the Piat.
For the first 2 years of the Second World War, the British had a really ineffective anti-tank rifle. But in August 1942, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, or Piat, was introduced. It's an unusual-looking weapon and very cumbersome. It's very heavy. It's about 15 kilograms in weight. It was really important that you got very, very close to the target. Ideally, if you're trying to knock out a tank, you want to be to the side of it, on its flank, or even better, behind it. You'd then sight it using this very simple upright foresight. So you'd pull the trigger, the spring would shoot forward, hit the detonator at the back of the bomb flies forward, the detonator would then recock the spring, ready for the next round to be put in it. One of the problems with it was that the tail end of the bomb was hollow, so it acted like a rifle barrel, so as it exploded, it would then fire the remains of the detonator straight back towards the Piat operator, so you'd have to duck out the way as soon as you'd fired. They were incredibly effective. There were some unit commanders that said that this was the most effective weapon that their section carried. It was also successful. There were more tanks knocked out with Piats than there were by rocket-firing Typhoons and Tempests.
On day 2, major British airborne reinforcements set off from England after a 4-hour delay due to morning mist. This second wave had no element of surprise, and as they approached the landing zone west of Arnhem, they came under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Bill Higgs was one of the glider pilots.
The Jerrys are already sized out where we're going to land them, because the landing ground was a big open space, you see, miles, and of course the Germans soon surrounded it with their guns, and they were knocking them out in the air, and as I was flying over, you could see a puff there, a puff there, a puff there.
Ich will nicht sagen, das war wie Tontaubenschießen, das wäre jetzt falsch ausgedrückt, aber zuerst konnten wir das gar nicht begreifen, dass die das noch vorhaben da.
Not only were the British under fire on the way in, but on the ground they found the Germans already attacking the landing zones themselves.
They were all around and they were really knocking us for 6. But I got down by these trees and I thought, I can get in by the trees. If I can get to the trees, I haven't got far to run, you see. So.
The surviving reinforcements gradually assembled, ready to move out. But there was another problem. The commander of British 1st Airborne Division, Major General Urquhart, had landed on day 1, but was now missing in Arnhem, which was swarming with German troops. To make matters worse, British radios weren't working. Frost's men at the bridge couldn't reach division headquarters just 3.5 miles away, or Corps HQ near Nijmegen.
When we got there, the signals didn't work, so that was a waste for a start.
I felt that because I couldn't even talk to my men, that I wasn't doing my job.
One of the things that caused Market Garden to go wrong almost immediately was the complete chaos and lack of communication in most of the drop zones. Especially around Arnhem, the paratroopers had been scattered so widely and so far away from their targets that they had little idea of where they were or what to do. In addition, their radios proved not to work all that effectively, and so they couldn't even talk to each other and figure out what was going on.
By the time of the Market Garden operation, the radio sets that were taken to Arnhem, there were 4 different types, and the set that was used between the companies and battalion was the wireless set 68. And that was very, very similar to this 18 set, which was the standard infantry radio set. It had links of copper aerial that slotted together. Wireless operators always used to say it was like having an enormous neon sign above you with this huge, great aerial waving around, telling the enemy where you were, which wasn't very popular. There were many problems with the radio communications at Arnhem, and a lot of those were known about before they set off. The whole thing was a gamble, and they gambled on the fact that radio equipment, which really wasn't quite up to the job, would just about do the job. They gambled on the fact that they'd got enough radio operators because inevitably, being an airborne operation, they'd cut down on the amount of people that they could take with them. And the problem with that, of course, is that once radio operators started becoming casualties and were killed and wounded, there were no trained operators to replace them. Some of the radios had batteries which were disposable, and obviously the problem with that is resupply in the middle of a combat zone. Other radios had rechargeable batteries, and again, in a combat zone, that was a very tricky thing to do, to gather radio batteries, get them back to a place where they could be recharged. But the big problem was procedure. In a lot of instances, they simply didn't follow the agreed procedure. The whole division changed their frequency for the radios. But by that stage, the divisional headquarters were already out of contact with the brigade that was trying to get through to Arnhem Bridge. So when they changed their frequency, there wasn't a hope of getting back in contact with them because they'd got no idea that the frequency had been changed.
Tony Hibbert set up 8 large wireless sets at his headquarters near the bridge.
But the problem was that they had been set up really for work in the open. And from the moment we reached Arnhem, we were out of touch.
While Frost and his men remained cut off at the north end of Arnhem Bridge, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division battled to reach them, in vain. The casualties were starting to mount.
You know, you was in for a fight. No two ways about it. And the Germans knew that they were reinforcing quicker than what we were. Our medics were filling up. Now and again, the general would say, Bloisy, go and see what the check is, you know, and you go in. Sometimes you shout to them and they'd give you by signs, you know, numbers. And that sometimes you went in there and these chaps be laying all round the wall, you couldn't get any more in there.
Meanwhile, 40 miles southwest of Arnhem, 30th Corps had reached their first objective, the Dutch city of Eindhoven, and linked up with the US 101st Airborne. Jubilant Dutch civilians cheered the British tanks as they passed through, half a day behind schedule. Their next objective was Nijmegen, but the city and its bridge were still in German hands.
When we got to Nijmegen, the Grenadier Guards in Shermans were in the lead, but when they got there, the American paratroops had not captured the bridge, which meant they had to fight for the bridge.
An attack on the bridge would mean more crucial hours lost, but there was no other option. On day 3, a combined assault by British tanks, infantry, and US paratroopers attempted to seize Nijmegen and its bridge, but ran into fierce German resistance. The attack failed. Back in Arnhem, Lieutenant General Urquhart had managed to rejoin his division, but breaking through to John Frost's men at the north end of the bridge looked increasingly unlikely. The rest of the division was now surrounded in the western suburb of Oosterbeek, struggling to hold its own position. Colonel Frost's force, just a few hundred strong, clung on desperately at the bridge as German attacks intensified.
We'd doing very well for the first 3 or 4 hours. And then, of course, the Germans put their artillery units on the other side of the river. And from that moment onwards, we were under a continual artillery attack. And on the next day, they started to bring up their tanks.
As the battle at the bridge became increasingly one-sided, the Germans sent a captured British engineer back to Frost's men with a message.
This engineer has come back over the bridge waving a big piece of white, waving it away, and he said, oh, the Germans want to surrender, sir. So he said, well, tell them to do it properly. I want 2 officers with a white sheet to come over and with no arms. No, sir, he said, I didn't mean it that way. He said, I meant they want you to surrender. He said, tell them to sod off. So he said, do you want me to go back? He said, do you want to go back? He said, no, I don't.
For all Frost's determination to fight on at Arnhem, his fate and the fate of his men rested with Allied forces 10 miles to the south at Nijmegen. where the bridge remained in German hands. But the commander of the 82nd Airborne had come up with a plan. Brigadier General James Gavin had been decorated for his role in the invasion of Sicily in 1943, made the night jump into Normandy on D-Day, and just 6 weeks before Market Garden was given command of the elite 82nd Airborne. He was an admired and charismatic leader who insisted that his officers be the first out of the airplane door and the last in the chow line. Faced with stubborn German resistance, Gavin proposed to have the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment cross the Val 2 miles downriver, so they could then launch an attack on the bridge from both ends. The crossing had to be made in collapsible wood and canvas boats under heavy enemy fire. Half the soldiers in the first wave were either killed or wounded. But with men across the river, the Allies could launch their simultaneous attack on both ends of the bridge. The Germans tried to blow the bridge, but the explosives failed and the surviving defenders fled. The road to Arnhem was open, but the Allied advance along Hell's Highway had been long and arduous, and they were now 30 hours behind schedule. Operation Market Garden's all-important timetable was in tatters. Ray Cumley was driving one of the Welsh Guards' Cromwell tanks, frustrated by their slow advance.
As we crossed, it was almost dusk, and we knocked 2 German tanks out there. But then we were at standstill overnight because we advanced the next day. And of course, when we advanced, we couldn't do it. And of course, the airborne were being closed in by the SS. There was no chance for them. And we were determined if only we could get there, but we couldn't.
At Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel Frost and his dwindling band of paratroopers still clung on to the north end of the bridge. But as each hour passed, more German reinforcements arrived in Arnhem, and they were now under sustained attack from German artillery, infantry, and armor.
The Germans, having dealt with other pockets of resistance, are now able to regroup their forces and, together with tank support, including Tiger tanks, to launch the last and final attack onto the bridge. And quite quickly, they then managed to overrun the British positions, merely because the British are running out of ammunition and supplies, and because a normal paratrooper unit is not equipped to deal with German Tiger tanks.
On the 20th of September, after holding the bridge for 4 days and 5 nights, Frost's men learned that there was no hope of them being relieved as planned. They requested a ceasefire to help with their enormous number of casualties. Brigade Major Tony Hibbert was an eyewitness to the grim scenes.
We had over 300 wounded in the hospital, and the building was on fire, and the flames were out of control. So we had to ask the Germans not only for the ceasefire, but for them to send us some of their men to help us get wounded out. That took about 2 hours, and at the end of that time, the Germans had infiltrated the perimeter that we'd been defending.
With no ammunition left, Frost's men began to surrender. But some decided to try and rejoin the rest of the division, holed up in Oosterbeek, 2 miles west.
There was no point in trying to defend the bridge, so I split them up into parties of 10 to try and make their way back to the main perimeter in Oosterbeek. But there were too many Germans. Wherever we went, we ran into Germans, and we were all taken prisoner.
During the truce, the German commander sought out his British counterpart.
Colonel Frost. He'd been badly wounded on the second day. still able to talk, the German commander came up and said, Colonel Frost, I salute you. We've just come back from Russia, where they'd been fighting for 2 years. He said, I've never seen any people as brave as yours. I salute you. That was nice.
But the courage and tenacity with which Frost and his men had held their ground had not been enough. Arnhem had proved a bridge too far. The 21st of September, day 5. With Frost's command eliminated, Arnhem Bridge was back in German hands. The rest of the 1st Airborne Division were dug in around Oosterbeek, on the wrong side of the river from British and American forces pushing up from Nijmegen. But 30th Corps' progress along Hell's Highway remained painfully slow. And now, British tanks were taking fire from one of Germany's most lethal weapons.
You were sitting ducks, as you might say, because the 88mm guns, these were the anti-tank the German had. I think it was the finest gun ever for tank warfare in particular.
Facing the British armour attack is a very strong German defence in depth. They've got weapons like the famous Pak-43 anti-tank gun. That's one of these ones here behind me. It's an 88mm gun, and it can fire a solid shot armour-piercing round that would penetrate one of the British Sherman tanks out to about 2.5 kilometres away. So you have the situation that British tanks are being knocked out and they can't even see the enemy that is firing at them.
Each time a German anti-tank gun picked off the lead British tank, the rest of the column was stuck behind it on the single road until the destroyed vehicle could be cleared. Corps Commander Lieutenant General Horrocks ordered his infantry forward, but they too ran into fierce German resistance.
We were desperate to relieve the airborne in Arnhem. The Germans were equally determined that we would not reach them, that they would surrender before we had a chance to cross the River Rhine and get back to them, get them out. And so it was a battle of attrition for 4 or 5 days.
30th Corps was running out of time. At Oosterbeek, the British airborne were critically low on ammunition and water. Attempts to resupply them by air were only partly successful, with most canisters falling behind German lines. And they remained under relentless attack from all sides.
We knew we were losing the battle because we get pulled into a perimeter, getting smaller and smaller, so we knew we ain't going to win it.
30th Corps began looking for alternative ways to reach the airborne troops at Oosterbeek. Their reconnaissance units, using small country lanes, found a route to the river that bypassed the main German defences, and at Driel made contact with the 1st Polish Parachute Brigade, who'd been dropped as reinforcements on day 3. Over the next few days, 30th Corps made several attempts to cross the river and link up with the Paras.
We sent a company of our 4th Dorsets across the river to form a bridgehead the other side, so then when the paratroopers were coming back, they knew where they'd get across.
But as airborne resistance north of the river began to collapse, any reinforcements who made it across risked sharing their fate.
I think they sent a whole company across, and not many of them came back. They didn't all get killed, but they got captured.
It was increasingly clear that Operation Market Garden had failed. The British priority became rescuing as many airborne troops as possible from the far shore of the Rhine.
The real issue on the ground at the time was, were the Germans about to overrun 1st Airborne Division's positions with perhaps a resulting massacre? The British knew there were SS troops involved. They were afraid there might be a massacre. In fact, there wasn't. The Waffen-SS troops were generally so impressed with the way that the paratroopers and glider troops had fought, that they treated them rather well. But again, in the big picture, it wasn't just about getting across and into Arnhem, it was about getting much further north into Holland with substantial forces, and that clearly was not going to happen at this stage. So the decision is taken to withdraw those forces across the Rhine, rather perhaps sarcastically entitled Operation Berlin.
The word came through they were going to pull out at 11 o'clock at night, but don't tell these Dutch people because we think they're pro-German because they live near the border of Germany, and so don't tell them we're pulling out in case they tell the Germans, you know. So we were in this trench, and they were all across the river. The Royal Artillery were firing two guns on the extreme right and left. Each one was a tracer, so we were told keep within them tracers, you know, otherwise they're shelling outside there. And we got to the river, the church, across the river. And now, that was horrendous there. The Germans knew we were getting out. Apparently, they thought at first the Poles were coming in across the river, but then realised we were getting out. So they shelled this place. That was the worst night of my life. And I have nightmares about that for many.
They managed to get about 2,400 Allied troops across the Rhine that particular night, which practically ends the fighting in the Arnhem area. And the Germans, of course, claimed this as their victory.
The Battle of Arnhem ended amid death and chaos and a humiliating British retreat. The recriminations began almost immediately.
I felt ashamed that, being English, that we was losing the battle through incompetence.
The British performed poorly because they didn't listen. They were good soldiers. They were brave. But the command, they were crazy. Dropping those people over there, knowing the German armor was over there. Dutch people told them, and the British insisted that they were wrong.
Characteristically, Montgomery refused to accept any blame.
Montgomery was an extremely capable commander with a massive ego who had the habit, particularly after the war, of saying that he could pre-plan all his battles perfectly and the enemy never had any say in it. He just carried out his master plan. He also said he never lost a battle. When asked about Market Garden, it was claimed it was a 90% success. That was very typical of the man.
Monty's master plan had not got the Allies across the Rhine and into Germany as promised, and the war would not be over by Christmas. Instead, Eisenhower's broad front strategy would resume once the Allies had resolved their supply crisis, a crisis that had only been exacerbated by Operation Market Garden.
Market Garden drew substantial amount of supplies away from other areas of the Allied front. Most importantly, the Southern American armies, like Patton's Third Army, were starved of fuel and had to slow their advance as a result. Market Garden also distracted Montgomery from other important areas of his responsibility. Most importantly, although the port city of Antwerp was captured, Montgomery neglected to capture the areas leading into the port. The Germans controlled the estuary between Antwerp and the sea, and that meant that the Allies couldn't start using the Antwerp port to bring supplies in for much longer time than they should have.
Operation Market Garden was one of the war's great what-ifs, a chance to shorten the war and so save many thousands of lives squandered through poor planning, and in spite of the heroism and skill of many who took part.
We jumped 17 September, and we were relieved by the Canadians on the 11th of November. We just sat there facing Germany. Just sat there, because it was a, as you British say, it was a cock-up. It was a cock-up. It was a mess, really.